Hello everyone, and welcome back to Midnight Horror. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the video. Story 1. I was home alone one quiet evening, a rare moment of solitude I had been craving after a long week of work. The air was cool, and the hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the house. I sat on the couch, scrolling through my phone, the dim light from the TV flickering across the room. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, their branches swaying in rhythm with the breeze, but everything felt oddly still inside. I hadn't noticed at first, but then something caught my eye, a dark figure outside the window. At first, I thought it was just the shadow of a tree, or maybe a trick of the dim light from the street lamp. But as I stared, the figure didn't move. It stood still, just on the other side of the glass, obscured slightly by the blinds. My heart skipped a beat as I squinted to make out any detail, but all I could see was the vague shape of a person standing there, unmoving. It was unsettling, to say the least. I told myself it was nothing, just some passerby or someone out for a late walk. Maybe they had stopped to look at the house, or perhaps they were just waiting for someone. But then, without warning, they knocked. 3 quick, deliberate knocks, the sound sharp and hollow against the quiet of the house. It echoed in the stillness, and for a moment, I felt my breath catch in my throat. I froze. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation, but there was none. No one should be standing at my window at this time of night, and certainly no one should be knocking like that. It wasn't a normal knock either. There was something eerie about the rhythm, almost too precise, too deliberate. And then it came again, 3 knocks, each one in the exact same pattern as the first. My pulse quickened. I backed away from the window slowly, trying to keep my movements as quiet as possible. My phone was still in my hand, but my fingers were trembling. Should I call the police? I couldn't decide, but my mind kept racing through every possibility. I was home alone, and the thought of facing whatever or whoever was outside made my skin crawl. I glanced at the door, half expecting to hear it rattle, but there was only silence. No footsteps, no sound of movement, just the oppressive quiet of the night. The knocking continued, now louder, more insistent. The rhythm was the same, but the force behind it seemed to grow. I could almost feel the sound vibrating through the walls. 3 knocks, a pause, and then 3 more. It was maddening. What did they want? What could they possibly expect by knocking on my window like that? The longer it went on, the more trapped I felt. I considered calling my neighbor, but I was too afraid to take my eyes off the window. I moved quietly across the room, trying to keep my breathing steady. The blinds were still pulled, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the person on the other side was watching me. It felt like they knew exactly where I was, that they were waiting for me to make a move. Each knock seemed to reverberate through the house, settling into my bones like a persistent, unwanted drumbeat. My mind wandered to every horror movie I'd ever seen, and I cursed myself for not locking the door when I first got home. After what seemed like an eternity, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise had been. I stayed frozen, my eyes fixed on the blinds, as though staring at them could somehow stop whatever was on the other side from moving. It felt like the air had thickened, pressing down on me, and my body was locked in place, unwilling to make a sound. I glanced at the clock. 10 minutes had passed since the last knock, and it felt like hours. And just as I thought it might finally be over, the knocking started again. But this time it wasn't just 3 knocks. It was 4. 4 knocks, each one slower and heavier than before. The pattern was different now. almost as if the person was mocking the rhythm from before, taunting me with a new variation. My mind screamed at me to do something, anything, but I remained frozen, my hands clammy and my heart pounding in my chest. Should I peek through the blinds? Should I confront them? The fear of the unknown kept me rooted to the spot. With every knock, my sense of reality seemed to bend, the space around me feeling tighter and more suffocating. The sound of the knocks was almost too much to bear now, each one jarring against the air in a way that felt unnatural. I couldn't tell if it was just the way my mind was processing the fear, but it almost sounded like there was something else to the knocks, something deeper, almost like a whisper between each strike. I swallowed hard, afraid that if I listened closely enough, I might hear words. Words meant for me. I finally made the decision. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hand shaking as I pressed the numbers. The operator answered, and I could barely get the words out, my voice trembling. I told them what had been happening. The knocks, the figure, the unnatural silence between. She told me to stay on the line and wait for the police to arrive. But as I held the phone to my ear, the knocking stopped again, leaving nothing but the distant sounds of the wind outside. I could still hear the operator's voice, calm and reassuring, but it was drowned out by a new sound, the sound of something scraping along the glass. I glanced at the window again, but this time the figure was gone. Story 2. Late at night, driving home from a friend's house, I noticed a car tailing me. It wasn't unusual to see a car on this stretch of road. It was a quiet neighborhood, and the occasional late-night driver was expected. But this was different. The headlights of the car behind me were blinding in the rear-view mirror, too close for comfort, too constant. At first I thought it was just a coincidence, but then the car seemed to follow every turn I made, as though it were locked onto my every move. I felt a chill creep up my spine as I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched. I switched lanes twice, then took a sharp right turn into a narrower street, hoping to lose the tail. The headlights stayed locked on me, still too close. Panic began to rise in my chest. The kind of panic that made every breath shallow and my hands clammy against the wheel. It was late, the street was empty, and the thought of being followed in such an isolated area made my heart race. I glanced in the rearview mirror, looking for a glimpse of the driver, but the car's headlights were too bright, blinding me with their intensity. It felt like the car was waiting for me to make a mistake, to take a wrong turn, so it could pounce. I increased my speed, my foot heavy on the accelerator, trying to get away, but the car maintained its pace, like a shadow that wouldn't leave me. There was no escaping it. I remembered a shortcut, an old alley I could take to lose the car. It was risky, but I had to try. As I approached the entrance to the alley, I made a sharp left, my tires screeching against the pavement. For a moment I thought I had succeeded, but then, from the corner of my eye, I saw the headlights dim. My heart dropped as I realized the car behind me had also turned into the alley, its headlights still glaring. The alley was narrow, lined with tall fences and overgrown trees. It felt like the walls were closing in on me as I drove faster, hoping the twists and turns would give me an advantage. The car behind me didn't falter, its headlights unwavering. I had to act quickly. I pressed the pedal to the metal, determined to lose the car, but the headlights stayed right on me, like a predator stalking its prey. At the end of the alley, I knew there was a dead end. I had no choice but to stop and hope that whoever was behind me would finally give up. I slammed on the brakes and turned the car off, hoping the dark, silent night would swallow me whole. The alley was still and quiet. The only sound was my heavy breathing as I sat frozen in the car. For a moment, I thought I might have lost the car, but then I heard the sound of the other car pulling up behind me. I dared not move, not even to look back. My mind raced as I debated my next move. Should I call the police? Should I try to drive out of the alley and face the car head-on? The tension in my chest tightened, and I fought the urge to panic. My phone was in the glove compartment, but I didn't want to make a sound. All I could do was wait and listen to the quiet hum of the engine behind me. Then, just as I thought my anxiety might consume me, something strange happened. The car's headlights turned off. The sudden darkness felt oppressive, as if it had descended on me in an instant. I held my breath, trying to remain as still as possible, hoping the car would just leave. The alley was thick with the scent of damp earth, and all I could hear was the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I stayed in that position for what felt like an eternity, not daring to make a sound. Then, the eerie silence was broken by the sound of tires rolling across the gravel. Slowly, the car behind me began to pull forward, but it didn't pass me. Instead, it seemed to inch closer, almost as if the driver was considering their next move. I couldn't see a thing. There were no more headlights, no silhouette in the window. Just darkness and the sound of the engine growing louder. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. If I started the car, I knew it would make noise, and I didn't want to alert the other driver. But if I sat here, I'd be trapped. I wasn't sure how much time passed, but when the sound of the tires finally faded away, I dared to peek in the rearview mirror. The alley was empty. The car had vanished into the night. I sat there for a long time, trying to gather my thoughts. My hands were still shaking, my mind a whirlwind of confusion. How had the car just disappeared? Why had it followed me for so long without making its presence known? My first instinct was to drive away as quickly as I could, but fear had rooted me to the spot. The eerie feeling in the pit of my stomach told me that something wasn't right. Eventually, I started the engine, the low hum of the car sounding loud in the silence. I shifted the car into reverse and slowly backed up, watching the shadows around me for any sign of movement. I was careful not to make any sudden moves. The thought of the car following me again lingered in my mind, but as I turned the corner and drove back toward the main road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't truly alone. The rest of the drive home was uneventful, but I couldn't relax. Every passing car seemed to be the same one that had been behind me earlier. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see the headlights glaring at me again, but there was nothing. My heart rate only began to settle when I finally pulled into my driveway, locking the doors behind me with trembling hands. That night I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes I saw the headlights in my mind. Even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that the car was more than just a random driver. Something about it felt deliberate, planned. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild, but I can't help but wonder who the driver was and what they wanted. Story 3. I was about to head to bed when I glanced out the window, ready for another quiet evening. The house was dark except for the dim glow of the porch light, and I was just about to switch it off when I froze. Standing just beyond the glass door was a man, completely still, staring directly at me. He wasn't knocking or trying to get my attention in any way. He was just standing there, his face expressionless, his eyes locked onto mine. I froze for a moment, unsure if I was seeing things. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or my mind playing tricks on me after a long day. But no, the man was there, just as clear as the soft light spilling over the porch. I took a few steps back, my heart starting to race. I didn't recognize him. He wasn't a neighbor, and he certainly wasn't someone I'd ever seen before. The air in the room felt thick, like I was suffocating under the weight of uncertainty. I stepped closer to the door, my fingers trembling as they hovered over the phone. Part of me wanted to open the door, confront him, ask what he wanted, but the other part of me screamed to stay hidden. I didn't feel safe. The man remained silent, his eyes never leaving mine. It was as though he knew I was watching, yet didn't care in the slightest. He didn't make a sound, didn't shift his position even slightly. My breathing became shallow as I hurried to dial the police. I couldn't take my eyes off him, even as my hands shook with the weight of what was happening. The phone rang once, twice, before I heard the dispatcher pick up. I gave them the address in a rushed voice, trying to stay calm. "There's a man on my porch. He's just standing there staring at me. I don't know who he is," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The dispatcher assured me help was on the way, but the words didn't bring me much comfort. Every second felt like an eternity, and the man never moved. He didn't seem to blink or show any sign of life at all. It was as though he was part of the night itself, a shadow that didn't belong. I could feel the tension building, my stomach knotting with dread. What did he want? Why was he just standing there? My mind spun with 100 possibilities, none of them good. I stayed on the line with the dispatcher, even though I knew there was little more I could do. The man didn't move, didn't speak, and I started to wonder if he even knew I was still there. Maybe he was waiting for something, an invitation, or maybe he was simply trying to intimidate me. I tried to focus on the sound of the dispatcher's voice, anything to distract from the growing sense of panic. The minutes dragged on, and my eyes remained locked on the man whose dark silhouette seemed to loom in the doorway. Suddenly I saw his hand twitch, the only movement he'd made since I first noticed him. It was as though he was going to knock, or maybe he was about to turn and walk away. But the moment passed quickly, and once again he was still. My mind raced even faster now. What was going through his head? Was he waiting for me to make the next move? Or was he just trying to provoke fear in me? The silence was maddening. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the rustle of my own shallow breath, but nothing else. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens approaching in the distance, a faint whine that grew louder. Relief surged through me, but I wasn't sure it would be enough. The man didn't seem to notice the sound. He didn't even flinch as the sirens grew louder, closer. I kept my eyes fixed on him, watching for any change, hoping he would make a move. The police would be here soon, I thought, and then this would all be over. But as the sirens drew nearer, something strange happened. The man turned away from the door and walked off the porch. I was too stunned to move. I watched in silence as the man stepped off the porch and into the darkness. He didn't run or hurry, but his movements were quick, purposeful. By the time the police arrived, he was already gone. The officers searched the area, but there was no sign of him. No footprints in the grass, no discarded cigarette butts, nothing. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The officers questioned me, but I could barely explain what had happened. How could I? It didn't make sense. There was no way he could have left without me hearing something. No way he could have disappeared so completely without a trace. The officers told me they would keep an eye out for anyone matching his description, but it was clear they didn't take the situation as seriously as I did. After all, there was no crime, no evidence of anything beyond my word. The man's presence lingered in my mind for days after. I couldn't shake the image of his still, unblinking eyes staring at me through the glass door. I kept thinking about what might have happened if I hadn't called the police, or if I'd opened the door. Would he have tried to come inside? Would he have hurt me? The uncertainty gnawed at me, and even though the man never returned, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. That night, and the days that followed, left me with more questions than answers. Who was that man? Why had he come to my house? The police never found anything, and no one in the neighborhood had seen him before. It was as if he had materialized out of nowhere, just to stand there, watching me. And when I thought about it long enough, I realized one thing. I didn't feel safe in my own home anymore. Story 4. Working late one night, I had settled into my apartment, catching up on some overdue work. The clock on my desk read 11:45 p.m., and the only sound in the room was the soft tapping of my fingers on the keyboard. I'd ordered dinner earlier in the evening, so when I heard a knock on the door, I figured it was the delivery guy bringing my food. But when I opened the door, the man standing there wasn't the delivery person I'd expected. He wore a navy blue uniform with a delivery company's logo stitched on the chest, but the name tag was blank. His expression was unnervingly calm, almost too calm. "I have a delivery for you," he said in a flat voice, holding out a large cardboard box. But there was no company name or address on it, just an odd, unmarked sticker. "What is this?" I asked, immediately growing wary. He looked at me for a moment, as if evaluating my reaction, then repeated, "A delivery." Confused, I stepped back, unsure of what to do. "I didn't order anything," I told him, my voice steady but unsure. He blinked but didn't move, just standing there, still holding the box. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rising. The man didn't seem in any rush, just staring at me as though waiting for some sort of instruction. Something about his demeanor was off, like he wasn't quite human. It was then that I noticed his eyes dull and lifeless, devoid of warmth or even interest. I hesitated. Maybe it was just a mistake. Maybe the wrong address was put on the package. I glanced at the address on the box. It wasn't mine. "This isn't for me," I said, my voice firmer now. I began to shut the door, but he placed his hand on it, stopping me. "It's for you," he insisted, his voice strangely soft. His fingers were cold, and I could feel an unsettling pressure through the wood. I felt my heart rate pick up as a sense of unease crept over me. "I told you this isn't my order," I repeated, stepping back again, my hand going to my phone. I was beginning to panic, but I tried to stay calm. "Please leave." My voice cracked slightly, betraying my growing fear. The man didn't respond. Instead, he stood there, unmoving, as though frozen in time. A heavy silence hung in the air, and I could feel the weight of his gaze on me. "Sir, I need you to leave now," I said, my hand tightening on the door handle. I could hear my pulse in my ears, and the pressure in my chest was becoming unbearable. I started to feel cornered. This wasn't just some delivery mistake. It felt deliberate. This man was not acting like anyone I'd ever encountered in a delivery uniform. His eyes shifted slightly as if something within him had changed. He didn't move, but the air around him seemed to grow thicker. It was as though his presence had infected the space, making everything feel more oppressive. The dim hallway light flickered for a moment, and I swore I saw something move in the corner of my eye, though nothing was there when I looked directly. The longer I stood there, the more I felt like I was being drawn into some kind of trap. I quickly stepped back and locked the door, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police, my hands shaking. The operator picked up, and I explained what had happened as quickly as I could, my voice tight with fear. "I don't know what's going on. There's a man at my door, and he's trying to force his way in with a delivery. It's the wrong address, and he won't leave." My words rushed out in a frantic mess. "Please, send someone." I could hear the operator on the other end, her voice calm and reassuring, telling me to stay inside, lock all doors and windows, and stay on the line until help arrived. I did as she instructed, moving to my bedroom and making sure everything was locked up tight. I felt like I was being watched. The quiet was deafening, broken only by the rapid beat of my heart. The minutes stretched on like hours, and the only thing I could hear now was the low hum of my air conditioner and my own breath. I kept an eye on the peephole, hoping to see the police arrive. Instead, all I saw was a shadow, the man still standing there in front of my door, unmoving, his presence filling the hallway. I held my breath as he slowly turned, almost as though he had heard me. He walked away from the door, his footsteps light and deliberate. I didn't dare open the door to check, but I could see through the peephole that he wasn't leaving. He was simply standing there, his back to me. Minutes dragged on, and with each second that passed, my anxiety grew. I glanced at my phone, but there was no update from the police. No sirens, no cars in the parking lot below. I couldn't tell if they were taking their time or if something had gone wrong. The man hadn't moved, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Something wasn't right. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the faintest sound, the soft click of footsteps on the stairs outside. I rushed to the window, peering down at the parking lot, but there was no sign of him. The only thing I could see was the empty street, quiet and still. My stomach twisted. Had he left, or was he just waiting for the right moment to return? Just as I began to relax, a knock sounded at my door. It was a hard, deliberate knock, 3 sharp raps. My blood ran cold. The police had arrived. I hurried to open the door, but when I looked through the peephole, the hallway was empty. The delivery man was gone. I opened the door cautiously, stepping out onto the landing, but there was no one there. No sign of the strange man. I felt my chest tighten as I looked around, but I couldn't see him anywhere in the building. The only thing that remained was the box he had tried to give me, now sitting on the floor in front of my door. The police arrived minutes later, but by then the man had disappeared entirely. They searched the area, but found nothing unusual. The delivery box was examined, but it was empty. No address. No return label. It was like it had never existed. They advised me to stay alert, but when I closed the door, the feeling that something was watching me lingered, an unsettling presence that never quite went away. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Story 5. It was one of those late nights that seemed to stretch forever. I had been at the office for hours, alone in the dimly lit space, the only sound being the hum of the fluorescent lights above me and the occasional rattle of the air conditioning. The stack of paperwork on my desk grew taller by the minute, and I couldn't help but wonder if anyone else was working at this hour. My mind was starting to feel fuzzy, and I desperately needed a break. As I scrolled through my phone, hoping for some distraction, the office phone rang. It startled me out of my reverie. The old desk phone wasn't something that rang often, and when it did, it usually meant trouble, or worse, it was someone trying to sell me something. But tonight, the call came from an unknown number 1 that wasn't in my contact list. I frowned and hesitated before picking it up. The moment I lifted the receiver to my ear, there was silence. I waited, expecting the usual robotic voice or a heavy-breathing telemarketer to make their pitch, but instead, there was nothing. I glanced at the phone, but the line was still connected. My heart rate picked up a little as the quiet stretched on, making me feel uneasy in the emptiness of the office. Then, just as I was about to hang up, I heard a soft whisper. My name. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. Sarah. The voice was low and breathy, like it was coming from just behind me, or maybe through the walls. I froze, my hand still clutching the receiver. My mind raced with questions: who would know my name? And why would someone call, just to whisper and hang up? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My skin crawled as I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting someone to be standing there in the doorway, their face obscured in shadow. But no one was there. The office was still, too still. I swallowed hard, trying to calm my breathing. I told myself it was just a prank, someone from the office messing with me. But then why hadn't they spoken up? Why had they just whispered my name and hung up? I stared at the phone in my hand, considering calling back, but something stopped me. What if it wasn't a prank? What if it was something worse? The voice had sounded so familiar, so intimate, like it had been someone who knew me, who had been watching me for longer than I cared to think about. I set the phone down slowly, as though afraid the voice might return the moment my attention wavered. The silence in the room pressed in on me. Every sound seemed amplified, every movement felt exaggerated. The flickering of the lights, the rustling of papers from the air conditioning, even my own breath, everything was too loud in the stillness of the office. I had worked late before, but this felt different, like the quiet had a weight to it, as though the office itself was holding its breath. A few minutes passed, but I couldn't focus on anything. My mind kept drifting back to that voice. Who was it? Why had they called? I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just some weird coincidence, but the more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. I had no idea who would have access to my private number, let alone the motivation to call me at this hour. I stood up from my desk, pacing the small office, trying to shake the unease that clung to me. My shoes clicked against the hard tile floor as I walked back and forth, glancing occasionally at the phone, almost expecting it to ring again, but it remained silent. I couldn't stop thinking about the voice. It had been so soft, so quiet, but there was something about it that had unsettled me, something that tugged at the edge of my memory, as though I should know it. I tried to distract myself by pulling up some work on my computer, but it was hard to focus. The screen blurred in front of my eyes, and my fingers moved over the keys without purpose. A part of me just wanted to leave, to pack up and head home, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I told myself it was probably nothing, just my imagination running wild after too many hours of work. But the whisper lingered in my mind, a ghost of sound that I couldn't escape. And then, as I was about to sit back down at my desk, the phone rang again. This time I didn't hesitate. My hand reached out, grabbing the receiver quickly, my heart hammering in my chest. "Hello?" I said, my voice too loud in the sudden silence. There was a long pause on the other end, and then the whisper came again. "Sarah." I froze, my breath caught in my throat. This time the whisper wasn't as soft, but still carried that same eerie, intimate quality. It felt wrong, like someone was standing just behind me, breathing down my neck. My pulse quickened as I slowly pulled the receiver away from my ear, staring at it in disbelief. But the line was already dead, just a hollow, empty silence. I slammed the receiver down on the base with a loud clack. My hands were shaking now, and I fought to keep my composure. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing in with every breath. My eyes darted around, half expecting someone to be standing in the doorway watching me, but there was nothing. Only the dim glow of the office lights and the soft hum of the air conditioning. I stood there for a moment, frozen, unsure of what to do. Should I call the police? Or should I leave the office? But what would I even say? That I had received 2 strange phone calls with a whispering voice on the other end. I didn't know what to think or how to explain it. My mind was racing, every worst-case scenario flooding my thoughts. As I stood there, the phone rang again. This time I didn't pick it up. I just stood there, staring at it, waiting for the inevitable whisper to come again. But the phone continued ringing, louder, more insistent, until I finally couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my coat and rushed out of the office, my heart pounding in my chest, and as I slammed the door behind me, the phone stopped ringing. I never went back to that office after that night. Story 6. I had always known my neighbor to be a bit peculiar, but it was the kind of strange that didn't make anyone suspicious. Mr. Adams, the man who lived next door, kept to himself most of the time. He would often be seen coming and going at odd hours, usually with a dark coat draped over his shoulders, no matter the weather. His house had always looked the same, a modest two-story with peeling white paint and a creaky fence that rattled in the wind. No one really talked to him, but that was fine. He never seemed to mind, and neither did we. One evening I came home from work later than usual, my car crunching the gravel of our quiet street. As I parked, I noticed a strange sight. Mr. Adams' door was wide open. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe he had forgotten to close it properly. But then I noticed that the porch light was flickering, and the faint smell of something stale hung in the air. I stood there for a moment, debating whether or not to go over and check. It felt like a breach of privacy, but something about the situation made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way the door was hanging ajar, as if someone had left in a hurry, or maybe it was just the unsettling quiet of the neighborhood at that time of night. Whatever it was, my curiosity won out, and I found myself walking toward his house, my heart beating a little faster with each step. The closer I got, the more I felt the weight of the silence around me. The streetlights seemed to dim, casting long shadows across the path. When I reached the door, I hesitated for a moment, but then I pushed it open. It creaked, as if the house itself was reluctant to let me inside. The air was thick and musty, like it hadn't been disturbed in days. I called out for Mr. Adams, but my voice echoed back at me, swallowed by the emptiness. I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under my feet. The living room looked strange, too strange. The furniture that had always filled the space was gone, leaving only dust-covered footprints and the occasional overturned lamp. It was as if someone had left in a hurry, but in the most disorganized way possible. The walls, once covered in paintings and old photographs, were bare now. The usual warmth of his home had been replaced by a cold, unsettling void. As I moved deeper into the house, I noticed more signs of abandonment. The kitchen was a mess, with dirty dishes left on the counter, some with old, dried food still stuck to them. The refrigerator was open, and the light inside flickered weakly. There were papers scattered across the floor, as though someone had been rifling through them hastily, leaving a trail of chaos in their wake. I couldn't understand what had happened, but something told me that whatever it wasn't good. I wandered from room to room, my steps slow and cautious. The bedroom was equally bare, with only a bed frame left behind. The closet was open, but all the clothes were gone, leaving the hangers to swing idly in the air. It felt like I had stepped into a place frozen in time, as if Mr. Adams had vanished in the middle of his life, leaving no trace of where he had gone. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken windows or signs of forced entry, just an eerie emptiness that seemed to cling to the walls. The further I went into the house, the more I began to feel the weight of something unseen pressing down on me. It was as if the house itself was watching me, its walls heavy with the secrets of its former occupant. I turned back toward the front door, but as I did, my eye caught something strange. On the floor near the staircase, there was a small, half-open drawer. It was just out of place enough to make me pause. I knelt down and pulled it open, finding a set of papers inside. They were neatly stacked, and although they appeared old, they seemed to have been handled recently. As I flipped through them, I realized they were not letters or bills, but something much more cryptic. The first few pages were filled with strange symbols, lines of text written in a language I couldn't recognize. It was odd, unsettling, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't something I was meant to see. I shoved the papers back into the drawer and stood up, my mind racing with questions. What had happened to Mr. Adams? Had he been in some sort of danger, or had he simply left? I glanced around one last time, but nothing about the house offered any answers. The quiet seemed to grow louder, pressing against my ears. I didn't know if I wanted to find out more, or if I should simply leave before I discovered something I couldn't handle. As I stepped back toward the door, I noticed something that I hadn't before, a small object lying on the floor near the staircase. It was a key, old and rusted, lying in a pool of dim light. My first instinct was to leave it alone, but something about it felt important. I bent down to pick it up, my fingers brushing the cold metal. As soon as I touched it, a chill ran through my body, and I immediately regretted my decision. I stood there, staring at the key, trying to decide what to do. It felt like a sign, but of what, I couldn't tell. My thoughts were interrupted by a sudden noise of faint creaking from upstairs. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself it was just the house settling, but something about it felt different, like someone was moving around up there. My breath caught in my throat as I turned toward the staircase, uncertainty gripping me. The thought of investigating further terrified me, but I had to know what had happened. My eyes scanned the shadows at the top of the stairs, but there was nothing there, just a darkened hallway leading to rooms I had yet to explore. I decided it was time to leave, to put whatever I had uncovered behind me. I slipped the key into my pocket, unsure of what it meant, and turned toward the door. As I stepped out onto the porch, the night air felt colder than it had before. I glanced back at the empty house, its door still standing open like an invitation. A shiver ran down my spine, and I quickly shut the door behind me. As I walked back to my own home, the unease lingered, a question that I couldn't shake. What had happened to Mr. Adams? And would I ever see him again? Story 7. I had parked in the empty lot, just like any other day. It was one of those quiet, sun-drenched afternoons when the air was still and the only sounds were distant birds and the hum of far-off traffic. I had errands to run, nothing out of the ordinary, and the lot was as desolate as usual. As I made my way back to my car, I noticed something strange. The door was wide open. At first, I thought maybe I had forgotten to lock it, but the more I looked at the car, the more unsettling the situation felt. The interior was untouched, nothing had been moved, nothing was missing. I couldn't make sense of it. My keys were still in my pocket, my phone was in my bag, and there was no sign of anyone who could have tampered with it. The lot was still empty, the only movement coming from the occasional wind that swirled dust across the cracked pavement. I stood there, frozen for a moment, staring at the open door. I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong, but I had no idea what. My first instinct was to check the back seat, but I hesitated. It wasn't that I thought anyone would be hiding there, at least not logically, but the thought that someone could have been watching me, or was watching me now, made the back seat seem ominous. The door creaked softly as the wind pushed it a little further, as if inviting me to take a closer look. I couldn't explain it, but my heart was racing. I glanced around the lot again. Still empty. I took a slow step toward the car, my gaze darting around the vicinity as if expecting someone to jump out from behind the surrounding cars. The strange thing was, I couldn't pinpoint exactly why I felt this way. There was no one around, and there was no immediate danger I could see. But the silence had grown oppressive, and the sense of being watched was overwhelming. I stepped into the car and locked the door behind me quickly, just to get the sense of security that the small action offered. As I started the car and backed out of the spot, I checked the rearview mirror. The lot behind me was still deserted, but something nagged at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was there, somewhere just beyond my sight. The sensation was subtle, but persistent. I drove out of the lot and onto the street, but as the car gained speed, the feeling of being watched didn't subside. If anything, it intensified, as if the air around me had thickened and was pressing in. I tried to push the sensation aside, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. It was probably nothing, just a fluke, a strange coincidence that didn't mean anything. But I couldn't help myself from glancing in the side mirrors every few seconds, half expecting to see someone following me. I kept the radio off, the silence amplifying the sound of my breathing as I tried to ignore the unease swirling in my chest. The world outside the car seemed distant, as though I was encased in a bubble, and every tiny noise, the hum of the engine, the rustling of leaves, felt too loud. I stopped at a red light, and that's when I noticed it. In the reflection of the rearview mirror, a figure appeared, standing at the edge of the lot I had just left. It was too far to make out any details, but the figure was unmistakable. It looked like a man, or at least the shape of a person, standing motionless and staring directly at me. My breath caught in my throat as the light turned green, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the mirror. The figure didn't move, didn't react, and just as quickly as I saw it, I lost sight of it. My pulse quickened, and I forced myself to focus on the road ahead. I couldn't tell if I had imagined it or if it had been real. What was the likelihood of someone being there, at that very spot, just when I happened to look in my mirror? Was it some sort of trick of the light, or had someone really been watching me? My grip tightened on the steering wheel, and I cursed myself for letting my imagination run wild. It wasn't possible for someone to just appear out of nowhere, right? The drive home was a blur. The only thing I could focus on was that figure. I kept checking my mirrors, convinced that if I looked closely enough, I'd see something move, see someone following me. But the longer I drove, the more I began to doubt myself. Had I seen something? Or had I simply been too eager to make something out of nothing? It was entirely possible I had convinced myself of it simply because I had been on edge after the door was left open. I pulled into my driveway and quickly got out of the car, glancing around one last time. The street was quiet, the neighborhood peaceful, but the nagging feeling remained. It was as if the world around me had shifted and something was just slightly off, out of place. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me as I did, trying to shake off the unease that clung to me like a second skin. The rest of the night passed in a haze of exhaustion. I told myself that I had been overly sensitive, that it was just a strange coincidence. But the thought of the door being left wide open, the figure in the rearview mirror, and the sensation of being watched gnawed at me, refusing to let go. I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than my mind playing tricks, but deep down I wasn't so sure. And that uneasiness followed me long into the night, lingering like a shadow I couldn't escape. Story 8. It was a quiet evening, just like any other. I was lounging on the couch, flipping through TV channels, when my phone buzzed on the coffee table. The number was unfamiliar, one I didn't recognize. I hesitated before picking it up, unsure if it was a telemarketer or something more important. But curiosity got the best of me, and I pressed the phone to my ear. Hello. The voice on the other end was low, almost too calm. I'm inside your house. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I thought I misheard. I glanced at the phone's screen again, wondering if it was some prank call, but the number didn't seem to be anything out of the ordinary. My heart raced as my mind spun. I could feel my pulse in my ears as I slowly put the phone on speaker and got up, cautiously making my way to the front door. I checked the locks one by one, my fingers trembling as I ensured everything was secure. The deadbolt slid into place with a soft click, and I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. But then, the voice came again, sending a chill down my spine. "I can see you." My blood ran cold. I turned around, my eyes scanning the room, half expecting someone to be standing in the shadows. Nothing. Just the dim light from the TV flickering in the otherwise silent room. I walked quickly to the window, heart hammering in my chest. Through the curtains, I saw a figure standing on my front porch, barely visible in the dim glow of the streetlight outside. My stomach flipped, and for a moment, I couldn't move. The figure was still, unmoving, and its presence seemed to loom in the air. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was someone out there, or was this some sick joke? I darted back to the phone, my fingers fumbling over the screen. I checked the caller ID, but the number was still unfamiliar. I tried to call the number back, but after a few rings, it went straight to voicemail. A sense of dread washed over me. I moved toward the front door again, hoping the figure on my porch would somehow disappear. But they were still there, their silhouette outlined against the streetlight. I stepped back from the door, trying to think, trying to figure out what to do next. I debated calling the police, but the fear of escalating the situation held me back. I didn't want to make a scene if this was just a misunderstanding. My phone buzzed again, and the voice came once more, eerily calm. "I'm still watching you." The words sent a shiver up my spine. My eyes darted to the window, and I swore I could see the figure shift, just a slight movement. They were no longer standing still. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my phone again, quickly dialing the police. My hand shook as I spoke with the dispatcher, explaining the situation. They assured me that help was on the way and asked me to stay inside and lock all doors and windows. But even as I locked the window, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every movement outside, every creak of the house felt amplified. The world around me seemed too still, too quiet. I couldn't help but glance back at the porch every few seconds, my eyes glued to the figure. They hadn't moved, but I had this awful sense that they knew I was watching. Time seemed to stretch, the seconds crawling by as I waited for the police to arrive. My mind played tricks on me, and I imagined the figure moving closer, just out of my line of sight. I was frozen in place, unable to tear myself away from the window. Then, as if on cue, I saw the figure take a step toward the door. My breath caught in my throat, and I backed away slowly, pressing myself into the corner of the room. They stopped, just out of the glow of the porch light, their face hidden in the shadows. I couldn't tell if they were wearing a mask or if their face was just obscured by darkness. But the moment I saw them move, a flood of terror washed over me. I scrambled to grab something for defense, anything I could use if the figure made it inside. My hands landed on a heavy lamp, and I gripped it tightly, my knuckles turning white. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. My mind raced, weighing my options. Should I try to run out the back door? No, I'd never make it. Should I stay on the phone with the police? I didn't want to risk letting the figure know I was alone and vulnerable. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. I could hear the faint sound of something scraping against the porch, like a foot dragging across the wood. It was subtle, but it was there. The figure wasn't just standing still anymore, they were moving, circling the house. I pressed myself against the wall, my breath shallow and quick. I had no idea where they were now, but I knew they were still there, somewhere just out of sight. Finally, after what felt like hours, the sound of sirens wailed in the distance. The figure paused, as if listening. My heart leaped in my chest as I heard the police car pull up outside. The figure on the porch remained motionless for a few more seconds before turning and disappearing into the night. I dared not look outside again, too afraid to see if they would come back. The police arrived within minutes, and I rushed to open the door. They quickly scanned the area, their flashlights sweeping across the porch and yard. But when they found nothing, they turned back to me, their faces grim. "Are you sure someone was out there?" one of the officers asked. I nodded, pointing toward the empty porch. "I saw them. I heard them on the phone." They promised to patrol the area more frequently, but the feeling of unease lingered long after they left. As I locked the door again and sat in the silence of my home, I couldn't help but wonder if I was truly safe. Had I imagined the whole thing? Or had someone really been watching me the whole time? Story 9. I shared an apartment with a roommate who, at first glance, seemed like a regular person. We had met through an online listing, and the agreement was simple. I'd cover the rent, and they would take care of utilities. Everything seemed fine at first, but there was something odd about my new living situation that I couldn't shake. No matter how late I returned from work, my roommate was always there, the apartment fully lit, and the sound of the TV blaring from the living room. It was unsettling, though I couldn't explain why. I'd come home after a long day of work, and the lights would always be on. It didn't matter the time, whether it was the middle of the afternoon or late in the evening. The apartment was always buzzing with activity. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe they were just a night owl, someone who preferred the solitude of the apartment while I was out. But as the days went on, it became more than just an oddity. It felt invasive. I never saw them leave, never heard the door close when they did. One day I decided to take matters into my own hands. I left a simple note on the kitchen counter, asking if they ever planned to move out or if I was going to be living with them indefinitely. I didn't know what else to do, but I figured it was worth a shot. The note was polite, but to the point. I wanted to know if I had a future in this apartment, or if I was stuck with someone who had no intention of leaving. When I returned home that evening, the note was gone. At first I thought maybe my roommate had taken it, but as I stepped into the living room, something hit me. Nothing had changed. The apartment was still exactly the same as it had been the day before. The lights were on. The furniture was arranged as if nothing had shifted. I felt a slight shiver crawl up my spine. It wasn't like my roommate to be so quiet, and it wasn't like them to not leave some sign of having been there. I decided to ask my roommate directly the next day, but when I returned home, they weren't there. The lights were off for the first time since I'd moved in. I felt a mix of confusion and curiosity. Where had they gone? I checked the apartment, opening closets, checking the bathroom. Everything was in its place. The only thing missing was my roommate. It was like they had never been there at all. Days passed, and I continued to live in the apartment. But every evening I found myself coming home to the same eerie routine. The lights would be on, the apartment fully furnished. No sign of my roommate. I began to wonder if I was imagining things, if maybe they had never been there at all. Could it be that I had been living alone, unaware that my mind had started to play tricks on me? One evening I decided to stay up late to see what would happen. I sat on the couch, pretending to watch TV but keeping my eyes on the door. It was around midnight when I heard the faint sound of footsteps outside. They were slow, methodical, like someone carefully walking past the door. My heart raced, but I remained still. The door didn't open, but the footsteps didn't fade away. It was as though the person on the other side was waiting, perhaps listening for me. The silence stretched on until I could no longer stand it. I jumped up, opening the door and stepping into the hall. No one was there. The corridor was empty, just the hum of the overhead lights above. I walked out to the stairwell and peered down the steps, but there was nothing. I returned to my apartment, my pulse quickening. I couldn't help but feel that something was wrong, something beyond just the strange absence of my roommate. The next day, I made a decision. I needed answers, and I needed to leave the apartment for a while. I packed a small bag and drove to a friend's place for the weekend, hoping to clear my head. I couldn't shake the feeling that the apartment wasn't right. There was no explanation for what had been happening. Why was everything so still? Why did it feel like the apartment was frozen in time? When I returned after the weekend, everything was as it had been. The lights were on. The TV was on low, playing something I didn't recognize. I couldn't bring myself to go inside immediately. I stood outside the door for a few minutes, trying to work up the courage to face whatever had been happening. I had to know if my roommate was still there, or if I was losing my mind entirely. I opened the door and stepped inside. The apartment looked the same as always, but this time I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There was a small pile of clothes in the corner of the living room. They weren't mine, and they weren't my roommate's either. They were clothes that had never been there before. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. My first thought was that someone had broken in. But then I realized something worse. Whoever had left those clothes, had they ever really left at all? I looked around again, and that's when I saw the note I had left for my roommate. It was folded neatly, placed on the kitchen table, where I had originally left it. But the words had changed. They were different now, scrawled in ink that wasn't mine. It simply said, "I'll be here when you come back." My blood ran cold, and I felt the oppressive weight of the apartment close in on me. Whatever had been happening, I wasn't sure if I would ever get to leave. As I stood frozen in place, I knew one thing for sure: my roommate, or whatever it was never going to leave. Story 10. I was driving home late one night, the kind of night when the roads are empty, and the only sound is the hum of my tires against the asphalt. It was past midnight, and I had just passed the last house on the outskirts of town when I saw it. A car, parked on the side of the road, its hazard lights flashing in the darkness. The car wasn't a new model, but it didn't look old either. It was a dark sedan, its paint dulled by years of wear, but it looked out of place. No other cars had been on the road for miles, so I slowed down, my curiosity piqued. As I drew closer, I noticed the car wasn't running, and there was no one around. I pulled over just behind it, the engine of my car idling as I glanced around. The night was eerily still, the only sound the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind. No one was in sight, and no lights illuminated the area, except for the flashing hazard lights of the abandoned car. I wondered if someone was stranded or in need of help. It was the right thing to do, I thought. Maybe they just needed a ride or help with a flat tire. I got out of my car, cautiously approaching the sedan. The air felt colder than it should have, and a shiver ran down my spine. The flashing lights on the car seemed to grow dimmer with each passing second. The interior of the car was dark, but I could make out the shape of the seats through the foggy windows. No sign of anyone inside. I knocked on the driver's side window, but there was no response. I tried the passenger side, and still nothing. Just as I was about to walk around to the back of the car, I caught something in my peripheral vision. A brief flicker in the rearview mirror. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, but then I saw it again. A figure, just for a moment, standing behind me. I spun around so quickly my heart skipped a beat, but the road was empty. No one was there. I took a few steps back, scanning the area, my breath catching in my throat. The night felt too quiet, too still, like the world was holding its breath. I looked back at the car, still parked with its flashing hazard lights, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Was it possible someone had slipped back into the car while I wasn't looking? I walked around to the back and peered through the rear window. The interior was just as empty as it had been moments before. I pulled my phone from my pocket, my hand slightly shaking as I dialed the non-emergency number for the local authorities. I was about to explain what I had found when I heard something faint, a soft creaking noise, like a door slowly opening. I froze. The noise was coming from behind me, from the sedan. I turned slowly, hoping to find some logical explanation, but there was no one. The car remained motionless. The only sound now was the continued flashing of its hazard lights. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me. My mind raced, trying to think of a reason for the strange occurrences. Maybe the person had left in a hurry, but why hadn't they turned off the hazard lights? The creaking sound stopped, and a strange, uncomfortable stillness took its place. I glanced down at my phone, still in my hand, but I couldn't bring myself to make the call. Something didn't feel right about this entire situation. I took a hesitant step forward, my heart pounding in my chest, as I made my way to the front of the car again. This time, when I looked into the side mirror, I saw it clearly, a figure standing behind me, just over my shoulder. My pulse quickened, and I spun around once more, but again, there was no one there. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I was sure I had seen someone, but the road was empty, the trees on either side aligned as ever. For a moment I stood there, frozen, staring into the vast emptiness of the road ahead. It was then that I realized that the world had gone utterly quiet. The soft rustle of the wind had stopped. There were no animals, no distant sounds of traffic, nothing. I couldn't stay here any longer. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to get in my car and drive as fast as I could. But my legs felt heavy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was still watching me. I quickly got back into my car, slamming the door behind me. As I started the engine, the hazard lights of the sedan suddenly blinked off. The sudden darkness of the car's windows sent a jolt of panic through me. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw something or someone moving in the back seat of the sedan. I wasn't sure if it was my imagination, but I didn't care. My foot hit the gas, and I sped down the road, my heart racing with every mile. The sedan was now nothing more than a fading light in the distance, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in my chest. I drove for miles, not daring to look back. The headlights of my car cut through the darkness, but in the rearview mirror, the emptiness was all-consuming. That night I couldn't sleep. My mind kept returning to that figure I had seen in the reflection. Who had been in the car? Who was watching me? I tried to brush it off as a trick of the light or my imagination, but deep down, I knew something had been wrong, something that couldn't be explained away. The next day, I passed that stretch of road again. The car was gone. No trace of it remained, not even tire marks where it had once been. I never saw it again, but I couldn't forget the feeling of being watched. Every time I passed that stretch of road, I found myself glancing at the shoulder, half expecting to see the flashing hazard lights again, but they never appeared. The memory of that night, of the figure in the rearview mirror, stayed with me, lingering like an echo in the dark. Story 11. I had been craving pizza all day, so when I finally decided to order one, I was looking forward to the simple pleasure of a hot meal delivered right to my door. The evening had been uneventful, and I'd spent it catching up on a show I'd been meaning to finish. As the minutes passed, the hunger gnawed at me, and I eagerly watched the clock, anticipating the arrival of my food. Finally, there was a knock at the door, and I jumped up, thrilled to see the pizza I'd ordered just moments ago. I opened the door, expecting the usual delivery exchange, a smile, a brief greeting, and a quick handoff. But instead, the delivery driver stood there, completely silent. He didn't say a word or even look me in the eye. His gaze was fixed somewhere just past my shoulder, and I couldn't quite place the unease that settled in my stomach. His expression was blank, his face emotionless, and he held the pizza in one hand, just out of reach, as if waiting for me to take it. The silence stretched on for far too long, and I found myself hesitating. This wasn't how it usually went. I reached for the pizza, and he handed it to me, but his movements were stiff, almost robotic. There was a coldness to him that made my skin crawl, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I said thank you, but he didn't respond, his gaze still distant, as if he hadn't heard me. The air between us felt thick with something unspoken. I tried to dismiss it as nothing, maybe he was just having a bad day or wasn't in the mood to talk. But as I took the pizza from his hands, I noticed something odd. He didn't move away. He just stood there, staring past me, not even acknowledging that I was closing the door. I had one foot inside, preparing to shut the door, when I realized that he hadn't shifted his position. It was like he was rooted to the spot, waiting for something. I felt a chill run down my spine. The seconds dragged on, and I felt the weight of his presence at my doorstep. It was unsettling, the way he didn't seem to react to the door inching closer to him. I had closed doors on delivery drivers before, but this time it felt different. His stillness, the way his eyes never flickered or blinked, sent an icy shiver through me. I couldn't shake the thought that something was off, that he wasn't acting like a normal person. It was as though he wasn't even aware of how strange his behavior was. Finally, I shut the door, but the uneasy feeling didn't leave. I told myself it was just my imagination, that maybe I had read too much into the situation. The night was quiet again, the sounds of the world outside muffled by the door. I placed the pizza on the kitchen counter, but as I started to remove the lid, I caught myself glancing back at the door. I couldn't help it. The memory of his unmoving presence lingered in the back of my mind. The longer I stood there, staring at the pizza, the more unsettled I felt. I tried to focus on the simple act of eating, hoping that the distraction of food would push the feeling away. But it was no use. My thoughts kept returning to the delivery driver, and I kept replaying the scene in my mind. Why hadn't he said anything? Why hadn't he left when I started closing the door? It felt like he was waiting for something more, like he had expected some kind of response from me. Just as I was about to take a bite, I heard a soft knock at the door. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, staring at the door. I didn't know what to think. It couldn't be the same delivery driver, could it? He had already left, and it had been too long. I hesitated, my hand still holding the slice of pizza, unsure of what to do. Should I open the door again? Or was it just someone else? I walked cautiously to the door, my pulse racing. There was a strange, heavy feeling in my chest as I reached for the handle. I cracked the door open just a little, enough to peek outside, but there was no one there. My eyes scanned the empty porch, the dim light from the street lamp casting shadows on the ground. There was no sign of anyone, no footprints in the snow or movement in the shadows. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I closed the door and locked it quickly, my hands trembling. I felt like I was being watched, but I couldn't explain why. The air in the room felt thick, and the silence was deafening. I returned to the pizza, but my appetite had all but vanished. I glanced at the clock. It was getting late. The unsettling feeling lingered in my mind, gnawing at me, but I tried to shake it off. I had no reason to believe anything unusual had happened, but the sensation of being watched wouldn't go away. As I tried to get back to my evening, I noticed something odd. The pizza box, which I had left open, now seemed to have something else inside it. I hadn't noticed it before, but now, under the slices of pizza, there was a small, folded piece of paper. My fingers trembled as I unfolded it, revealing only a few words written in a shaky hand: "I'll be back." My heart pounded as I read it over and over, trying to make sense of it. Was this some kind of sick joke? Or had the delivery driver left it behind? I immediately went to the window, pulling back the blind slightly to look outside, but there was no one there. The night was quiet, too quiet, and for the first time that evening I felt truly afraid. Story 12. It was well past midnight when I arrived at the office building. The only sounds were the hum of the fluorescent lights and the faint buzz of the security cameras. I worked a late shift that night, and by the time I was ready to leave, the building was completely empty. The halls were silent, and I found myself alone in the elevator, the doors sliding shut behind me with a soft chime. As the elevator began its descent, I felt a shift in the air, as if something had changed. The doors opened again on the next floor, and a man stepped inside. He was dressed in a dark coat, and his movements were deliberate, too calm. Without saying a word, he pressed every button on the panel, causing the elevator to begin its upward journey again. I glanced at him briefly, my unease growing, but I said nothing. After all, the building was empty, and the elevator was just another part of the routine. The doors closed with a soft hiss as we began to ascend. At first, I thought it was just another late-night worker, but something about the man felt off. His silence was unnerving, and his gaze seemed to linger on me, even though he wasn't making any effort to speak. I tried to keep my eyes forward, focusing on the numbers lighting up above the door as we passed each floor. The elevator moved slowly, but the sensation of his presence seemed to make it feel much longer. We passed the third floor, the fourth, and then the fifth. Each time the elevator stopped, the man didn't move, just continued standing still with his hands in his pockets, staring at me. It felt like he was studying me, waiting for something, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My stomach twisted in a knot as the silence in the small space pressed in around me. The sound of the elevator's slow ascent was deafening, amplifying my unease. By the time we reached the top floor, I had stopped looking at the man altogether. My heart was beating fast, my palms sweaty. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up as the elevator door opened with a soft chime. He didn't move, didn't step out when the door slid open. He just stood there, his gaze fixed on me, unblinking, his face expressionless. The air felt thick with tension, and I knew I couldn't stay in the elevator with him much longer. I had to get out. I hesitated for a moment, my body frozen in place as I considered my options. I could leave the building and take the stairs, but the man was still blocking the doorway. If I made a move, he might follow me, but if I stayed in the elevator, I would be trapped with him. My instincts screamed at me to get away, to leave as quickly as possible. Gathering every ounce of courage, I took a step toward the door. The man didn't move, his eyes never leaving mine. My heart raced as I pushed past him, brushing against his coat. His stillness was chilling, his presence so overwhelming that it felt like the world outside had disappeared. I forced myself to walk out of the elevator, my legs trembling beneath me. I didn't dare look back as I walked down the hallway, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the silence. I made my way to the stairwell, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The building was eerily quiet, the only noise coming from the distant hum of the air conditioning. I pushed the door open and descended the stairs quickly, my mind racing with thoughts of the man in the elevator. Who was he? Why had he acted so strangely? I tried to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. but it lingered like a dark cloud, following me every step of the way. When I finally reached the ground floor, I breathed a sigh of relief. I hurried out of the building, the cool night air hitting my face like a wave. The street outside was quiet, the lights of the city glowing faintly in the distance. But even as I walked to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the man from the elevator following me. But there was nothing. Just the empty street, the sound of my footsteps, and the rising sense of unease in my chest. I drove home that night in a daze, my mind replaying the encounter over and over. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man's face, his cold stare following me even in the darkness of my car. I couldn't understand what had happened, or why I felt so unsettled. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination running wild, but something about it felt real, too real. The next day, I told a coworker about the man, but they brushed it off as a strange but harmless encounter. They suggested that maybe I had been tired, that the late night hours had made me more anxious than usual. But I couldn't forget the way the man had stood there, unblinking, unmovable, as if he were waiting for something. My mind kept circling back to that moment, the eerie silence, the unsettling tension that had filled the elevator. A week later, I returned to the building for another late shift. As I stepped off the elevator on the top floor, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread wash over me. The air felt different, charged with something I couldn't explain. I tried to push the thoughts from my mind, but as I turned the corner, my heart skipped a beat. There, at the far end of the hallway, stood the same man. His back was turned, but I knew it was him. He didn't turn around. He didn't even move. But I knew deep down that he was still waiting. Story 13. It was a regular morning when I sat down with my coffee and opened my bank statement. I had just finished reviewing my spending for the month when a particular charge caught my attention. There was a transaction for a large sum from a place I didn't recognize. It wasn't an online store, or even a familiar merchant, just the name of an ATM near my apartment. I stared at the charge, my mind racing. How could this be? I hadn't used an ATM in weeks, let alone one near my apartment. I quickly scanned the rest of the statement, but there was no other unusual activity. The charge stood out, glaring at me like a red flag. It didn't make any sense. How could someone have used my account without my knowledge? I picked up my phone and called the bank immediately, hoping they could offer some explanation. The representative on the other end of the line was polite but seemed just as confused as I was. She asked for the details of the transaction, including the date and time, which was listed as 2 a.m. I felt my stomach drop. That was an odd time for anyone to be making a transaction, let alone someone I didn't know. The representative assured me that the charge was legitimate, but there was no way it could have been made by me. I hadn't been anywhere near that ATM. She told me that they would launch an investigation, but I had to be prepared for the fact that the charge might still show up as valid unless they could find evidence of fraud. The more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. Someone had used my card at a time when I was sound asleep, and now I had no idea who or why. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, my mind spinning. I retraced my steps, trying to remember if I had perhaps used the ATM and forgotten about it, but nothing seemed to add up. I hadn't gone out the night before, let alone at 2 a.m. The whole situation was baffling. I decided to check my security cameras around my apartment just in case, hoping to spot something that might explain it all. When I pulled up the footage from the previous night, my heart skipped a beat. There was nothing. No one had approached the ATM near my apartment, at least not during the hours I checked. But then I remembered something odd. The footage only captured part of the street corner where the ATM stood. I would need to check a wider angle to see the whole area, but I didn't have access to that. Feeling uneasy, I walked around the neighborhood the next day, hoping to find any clue that might lead me to the answer. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The area around the ATM was usually quiet at night, and there was no reason for anyone to be there at that time, especially not someone using my account. I spoke to a couple of neighbors, asking if they had seen anything unusual, but they all said no. No one had noticed anything out of the ordinary, and I was left with even more questions than before. Days passed, and I heard nothing from the bank. I called them again, hoping for an update, but they said the investigation was still ongoing. They couldn't provide me with any specific details about who had made the transaction or how they had gained access to my account. All they could tell me was that the ATM was in a well-lit area with several security cameras, and they would be reviewing the footage. I couldn't help but feel paranoid. Every time I walked near that ATM, I scanned the area, looking for any sign that someone was watching me. I began to avoid walking by it altogether, just in case I might be spotted. It was as though my once familiar neighborhood had suddenly become a place full of unknowns, where someone was out there, using my account and hiding in the shadows. One evening, as I was leaving my apartment, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. There, on the sidewalk near the entrance of my building, was a man standing still, staring at me. I couldn't see his face, as he had a hood pulled low over it, but his posture was unnervingly still. He didn't move as I walked past him, his eyes never leaving me. I quickened my pace, heart racing in my chest, wondering if he had anything to do with the transaction at the ATM. The encounter left me shaken, but I tried to shake it off. I couldn't be sure he had any connection to the incident, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. That night, I kept the lights on and stayed close to my phone. I couldn't help but wonder if the man had been involved somehow, if he had somehow gained access to my account in some way I didn't understand. But every time I tried to connect the dots, they didn't quite line up. A week later, I received an email from the bank with an update on the investigation. They had reviewed the security footage from the ATM and confirmed that the transaction had indeed been made using my card. However, they couldn't identify the person who had used it. The footage was grainy, and the person's face was obscured. They did, however, mention that the ATM had a history of issues with fraudulent activity, and they were working to improve security measures. At that point, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The bank was taking the matter seriously, and I wouldn't be held responsible for the charge. But the feeling of unease lingered. How could someone use my card in such a precise, calculated way without leaving any evidence? I couldn't help but feel that the answer was just out of reach, like a puzzle with missing pieces. Even though the charge was reversed, and I was assured that everything would be handled, I couldn't stop thinking about that man by the ATM. Was he connected to the fraud, or was it just a coincidence that he had been there the same night? My life had been turned upside down by a simple bank statement, and now, I wasn't sure if I'd ever feel completely safe again. Story 14. It had been a long day at work. The clock on my desk blinked 11:45 p.m., the dim light of my office casting long shadows against the walls. I was exhausted, but I still had a few things to finish up before I could head home. The office was eerily quiet, the usual hustle and bustle of coworkers now replaced with the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I glanced out the window at the darkened parking garage, my car parked far in the back, alone in the sea of empty spaces. I grabbed my jacket, slinging it over my shoulder as I turned off my computer and collected my things. The office had emptied out hours ago, leaving only me behind, finishing up last-minute tasks. I could hear the faint echoes of my footsteps as I walked toward the elevators, my mind on the work I'd left unfinished, and the drive home that seemed farther than usual. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and I stepped inside, hitting the button for the garage level. The ride down was uneventful, but the quiet of the parking garage hit me as soon as the doors opened. It felt oddly deserted, the concrete floor echoing every movement I made as I stepped out into the cavernous space. My car was parked at the far end, a good distance from the elevator, and I had no choice but to make the walk. The garage was always empty at this hour, but tonight it felt different, the stillness almost oppressive. As I made my way down the aisle of parked cars, I heard a noise behind me. At first it was faint, just a rustling sound. I glanced over my shoulder but saw nothing. I shook my head, trying to shake off the feeling that I was being watched, and continued walking toward my car. The sound came again, a soft shuffle of footsteps on the concrete, too close to be a car engine idling or the wind shifting. I stopped, listening carefully. The footsteps weren't random, they had a rhythm to them. I turned around quickly, expecting to see someone behind me. But there was no one. The area around me was still, the shadows stretching far in the corners of the garage, and no other cars had moved. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. My heart raced, and I tried to dismiss the thought that had crept into my mind someone was following me. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a car door closing far off, or just the echo of my own movements. I forced myself to keep walking. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. This time they were faster, hurrying, as though someone were trying to catch up with me. The sound of shoes slapping against the concrete was unmistakable. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing just a few feet away, but the space was still empty. There was no sign of anyone, no movement, no shadow shifting. My car was just a few rows ahead, but it felt miles away now. I began walking again, this time with a quicker pace, my mind racing. Every step I took, the footsteps behind me followed. The sound seemed to be matching my own, growing faster as I increased my speed. I glanced over my shoulder again, but once more I saw nothing. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. My pulse quickened, the feeling of being pursued growing stronger with every passing second. My body wanted to break into a run, but I didn't, as something kept me moving at a brisk pace, trying to remain calm, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then, the footsteps slowed. The rhythm changed. It was like someone was pacing me fast, then slow, then fast again. The sound seemed to ebb and flow, as if whoever was behind me was deliberately keeping their distance. I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest, but I refused to turn around. I kept my eyes fixed ahead, determined to reach my car and get the hell out of there. But the feeling of being followed didn't leave. It intensified, and I could almost feel the air around me shift, as if something invisible was right behind me. I reached the last row, my car just a few feet away now, but the footsteps were still there, keeping time with mine. My breath was shallow, my legs feeling heavier with each step. I was almost at the car, just a few more steps, but the footsteps didn't stop. In fact, they grew louder, closer, until I could practically feel someone breathing down my neck. My hand fumbled for my keys in my pocket, the cold metal pressing against my skin. I reached the car, my hand trembling as I unlocked it. The door clicked open with a satisfying sound, but as I swung it open and began to climb in, I heard it one last step, right behind me. It was like a whisper, a final warning. My heart leapt into my throat as I slammed the door shut and locked it in one swift motion. I didn't even take the time to start the engine immediately. I just sat there, my hands gripping the steering wheel, staring out through the windshield. The footsteps had stopped. I waited a moment, staring at the empty space behind me, convinced that something was there. But there was nothing. No one. The garage, once so full of eerie noises and shadows, was still and silent once more. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, and started the car. The engine roared to life, breaking the silence. As I pulled out of the garage, I glanced back one last time, my eyes scanning the dark corners of the parking lot. But there was nothing. No figure, no footsteps, just the quiet of the empty garage. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that I hadn't just imagined the footsteps. But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't escape the strange sense that I wasn't alone. Even as I drove away, the chill of the garage lingered in the back of my mind. Something had been there, something I couldn't explain, and I couldn't help but wonder if I would ever hear those footsteps again. Story 15. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon as I laced up my boots, preparing for another solo hike through the wilderness. The cool breeze was refreshing against my skin, the crisp air hinting at the change of seasons. I had always enjoyed hiking alone, the solitude allowing me to clear my mind and escape from the noise of everyday life. The trails I frequented were familiar to me by now, but there was always a new path to explore, a new adventure waiting to unfold. I was several miles in when I first encountered him. He was standing at the edge of the trail, looking out over the valley below, his posture tense, as if he were waiting for something. His gear was worn, and his face was weathered from years of hiking. At first, I thought he was just another seasoned hiker, enjoying the view, but as I drew closer, I noticed the look of concern in his eyes. "Hey there," I called out as I approached, eager to strike up a conversation. "How's the trail today?" He turned to me slowly, his eyes narrowing as if sizing me up. There was something about his presence that made me uneasy, but I brushed it off as just the nature of the wilderness. He gave me a curt nod before speaking, his voice low and gravelly. "You planning on heading down that trail?" he asked, gesturing to a narrow, winding path that split off from the main road. I glanced at the trail he was referring to, a faint sense of hesitation creeping up my spine. It looked just like any other path, worn but not impassable. The kind of trail I had taken many times before. But something about his tone made me pause. "Yeah, I was thinking of it," I replied. "Why?" His gaze hardened, and he took a step closer, lowering his voice as if to share a secret. "That trail, it's dangerous. People go in, but they don't always come out. Something about it doesn't sit right. I wouldn't go down it if I were you." I was taken aback by his warning. Most hikers I met were friendly, offering tips about the terrain or recommending spots with great views, but this man's warning felt different. It wasn't just caution, it was fear, palpable in the way his eyes darted around, as if someone or something might be watching us. "I'll be fine," I reassured him, smiling politely. "I've hiked these trails before. I know what I'm doing." He shook his head, almost as if he pitied me. "You won't. Trust me on this one. The trail has a way of changing people. It'll mess with your head. It's not worth it." Before I could ask more, he turned and began walking back down the path I had just come from, disappearing into the dense trees with no further explanation. I stood there for a moment, the weight of his words lingering in the air. The logical part of me dismissed his warning as superstition or some bad experience he had on the trail, but a small part of me felt a chill run down my spine. Still, I shrugged it off. I had hiked alone for years, and I wasn't going to let some stranger scare me off. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping and the cool touch of dew on my tent. The sky was clear, the sun rising slowly over the peaks, casting an orange glow on the landscape. I packed up my gear and headed back to the trailhead, my mind already on the hike ahead. I passed the same junction where I had met the hiker the day before, but the path looked just as unremarkable as it had then. I stood for a moment, staring down the trail. I thought about the man's warning, but the sense of adventure and curiosity won out. I had come this far, I wasn't going to let fear hold me back. With a deep breath, I took the first step onto the narrow trail, the dense forest quickly swallowing me up as I ventured further into the wilderness. The first few miles were uneventful, the trail winding gently through the trees. But as I went deeper, the landscape began to change. The path became steeper, more uneven, and the once clear markers started to fade, leaving me to rely on my instincts to guide me forward. The air grew thicker, the silence heavier. It was as though the forest itself was closing in on me, pressing in from all sides. A sense of unease settled over me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Hours passed as I navigated the increasingly difficult terrain, my mind beginning to feel clouded. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something about this trail felt different. The quiet, the isolation, it was unsettling, like the world had been muted. My footsteps seemed too loud in the silence, my breathing too heavy. I pushed on, telling myself that it was just my mind playing tricks, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the trail was somehow wrong. That night I set up camp near a clearing, the strange sense of dread still gnawing at my mind. I tried to sleep, but every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves outside my tent made my heart race. When I finally did manage to drift off, I had vivid dreams of the hiker, the one who had warned me. In my dream, he was calling my name, his face twisted in a silent scream as the forest closed in around him. I woke with a start, gasping for air, and immediately checked my surroundings. The forest was still. I couldn't remember if the hiker had ever been real, or if he had been some product of my overactive imagination. The unease gnawed at me, but I packed up my camp and continued down the trail. The next morning I reached the trailhead again, exhausted and unsettled. As I passed through the small town nearby, I noticed a crowd gathered around a bulletin board. A recent news report caught my eye. A hiker had gone missing on the very trail I had just traversed. The search for his body was still ongoing, but no one had found any trace of him. The details of the report sent a cold shiver through me. The man's description matched the hiker I had met the day before. I stood there for a moment, the weight of what had happened settling in. I had been warned, and I had ignored it. The man I had met, the one who had so urgently told me to stay away from that trail, had he been trying to save me? Or had he too been swallowed up by the woods, his warning now lost to the winds? I never went back to that trail, and the memory of that hiker, his warning, his face haunted me for years. I couldn't help but wonder how many others had wandered down that same path, only to disappear without a trace. Some trails are meant to be left unexplored. Story 16. I had arrived at the hotel for a business trip, the last stop before heading back home. It was a small, somewhat outdated place, but it was clean and quiet, offering everything I needed for a short stay. My room was on the third floor, overlooking the back parking lot. The hotel staff was friendly, and after a long day of meetings, I settled into my room, ready to get some rest before another busy day. The first night, I didn't think much of it. I had just finished reviewing my notes for the next day and was about to fall asleep when I heard it. The sound of footsteps in the hallway. At first it was faint, almost like someone walking casually down the corridor. I tried to ignore it, assuming it was another guest on their way to their room, but the footsteps grew louder. They grew closer, one step at a time, until they stopped right outside my door. I held my breath, straining to hear anything else, but the footsteps were gone. I waited a few moments, unsure of whether to open the door. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it someone looking for their room? A maintenance worker? But I hadn't heard any voices, no keys jiggling in locks, nothing. With a sigh, I got out of bed and opened the door cautiously, hoping to find an explanation. To my surprise, the hallway was empty. No one was in sight, and the silence felt almost oppressive. I stood there for a moment, my hand still gripping the door handle, feeling a strange chill in the air. I glanced up and down the hallway, but it was completely deserted. I stepped out into the corridor, checking the other rooms nearby, but everyone's doors were shut tight. It didn't make sense. The footsteps had been so clear, so close, yet there was no one there. I returned to my room, slightly unsettled but telling myself it was just my imagination. Maybe it was the building settling, or a late-night guest returning to their room. I tried to shake it off and went back to bed, convincing myself it was nothing to worry about. But when the same thing happened the next night, I couldn't dismiss it as easily. The second night, I had just turned off the light and closed my eyes when I heard it again. The same slow, deliberate footsteps echoing in the hallway. This time I was more awake and aware of the sound. They were louder, closer. I could hear the distinct tap-tap of shoes against the hotel's carpeted floor, followed by a brief pause. Then more steps. It was as if the person was walking slowly, deliberately, inching closer and closer to my room. I was starting to feel a sense of dread creeping up on me. This wasn't normal, and the feeling of being watched was undeniable. I pulled the covers tighter around me and tried to ignore the sound. But it grew louder still, until it seemed like the footsteps were right outside my door again. I couldn't take it any longer. I got out of bed, heart pounding, and opened the door. Again, there was no one there. The hallway was completely silent, just as empty as it had been the night before. The lights were dim, casting long shadows along the walls. I stepped out into the corridor, my eyes scanning the space for any sign of movement. But nothing. It was as if the footsteps had never existed. I stood there for a moment, confused and anxious, before returning to my room, locking the door behind me. That night I didn't sleep much. The sound of the footsteps lingered in my mind, and every creak of the building seemed to amplify the tension. I kept expecting them to return, but eventually the night passed without further incident. The next morning I tried to brush it off as a figment of my imagination. The hotel had been quiet during the day, and I focused on my work, telling myself that it was just a coincidence. But when the same thing happened again on the third night, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I was sitting in the armchair by the window, reading some emails, when I heard the footsteps once again. This time I stood up immediately, listening more intently. They were closer than ever, unmistakable in their rhythm and pace. Slowly I walked toward the door, my hand hovering over the handle as I prepared myself for whatever I would find. I opened the door a crack, just enough to peer outside, and saw nothing. The hallway was as still and silent as it had been on the previous nights. I opened the door fully this time and stepped into the corridor, my eyes scanning the area in every direction. There was no one in sight, and the footsteps had stopped, leaving an eerie stillness behind them. This time I decided to investigate further. I walked down the hallway, checking each door as I passed, wondering if someone else was experiencing the same strange phenomenon. But every door was closed, just as I had left it. The hotel felt almost abandoned, as if everyone had disappeared into the walls. I made my way to the staircase, but everything was quiet, too quiet. I returned to my room, my nerves on edge. That night, I didn't hear the footsteps, but the silence was just as unnerving. The sensation that someone or something was watching me never left. Even when I closed my eyes, I felt like the eyes of the hallway were still on me. I packed my things quickly the next morning, eager to check out and leave the unsettling experience behind. As I handed the key card back to the front desk clerk, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened in that hotel. Something I would never understand. The clerk smiled politely, but I could see a hint of something in their eyes, a glimmer of recognition. "Hope you enjoyed your stay," they said, their voice almost too cheerful. I forced a smile and nodded, eager to leave. As I walked out of the hotel, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. The building stood there, quiet and unchanged, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it had held a secret. A presence that walked its halls when no one was looking. A presence that would remain long after I was gone. Story 17. I had been looking forward to the weekend getaway at my friend's house. They had a beautiful home nestled in a quiet part of the city, far from the noise and bustle of daily life. It was the perfect place to relax, catch up, and unwind. My friend Sarah had invited me to stay in the guest room, which was located at the end of a long hallway, away from the main areas of the house. After a day of fun and laughter, we had dinner together and then retired for the night. Sarah showed me to the guest room, a cozy space with soft, comfortable bedding and a view of the small garden outside. I felt at ease, ready to get a good night's sleep. As I unpacked my bag, I noticed something odd. The door to the guest room was locked from the outside. I tried to twist the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. The keyhole stared back at me, empty and silent. I thought it was a mistake. Maybe Sarah had simply forgotten to unlock it before I arrived, or perhaps the lock had gotten stuck. I called out to her, but the house was quiet. I assumed she must be in her room, so I decided to text her instead. I sent her a quick message, asking if the door was meant to be locked. A few moments later, she responded, her reply seemingly calm and reassuring. "Oh, it's just a mistake," she said. "I'll be up in a minute to fix it." I waited, still feeling uneasy but trying to push the strange feeling away. The door was locked, but Sarah had assured me it was an accident. I sat on the bed, waiting for her to come up, but the minutes seemed to stretch on. It was quiet, almost too quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The house seemed too still. The quiet hum of the night felt like it was amplifying every small sound. After what felt like an eternity, I heard footsteps approaching the door. I quickly stood up, thinking Sarah had finally come to unlock it. But when I peered through the small crack at the bottom of the door, I saw nothing. The footsteps had stopped, and the air grew even more silent. I called out Sarah, but there was no response. I waited, holding my breath, but nothing happened. The house remained still. Confused, I called her again, this time more urgently. There was no reply. The door remained locked, and no one seemed to be around. A wave of unease swept over me, making it hard to breathe. I felt trapped, as though I had no control over the situation. The door, the silence, and the growing sense that something was wrong gnawed at me. Why hadn't Sarah come up to unlock it yet? I tried to distract myself, hoping the feeling would pass. I sat back on the bed and tried to focus on something else. I checked my phone for messages, but there was nothing new. I went to the window, hoping the fresh air would calm me, but the garden outside was eerily still. The moonlight cast long shadows across the yard, and I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. The longer I stayed in the room, the more I felt that something was off, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I decided to try one more time. I texted Sarah again, telling her I was starting to feel uncomfortable. I asked her to come upstairs immediately and unlock the door. She responded quickly this time, but her message didn't quite match the tone of the previous ones. "Sorry, I must have fallen asleep. I'll be there in a minute." But the tone felt wrong. It wasn't just the wording, but something in the way it was written made me feel uneasy. The use of "I'll be there in a minute" felt distant, as if she wasn't at home. The minutes dragged on and still no one came. I felt the weight of the silence pressing down on me. I wondered if I had misread the situation, if Sarah was perhaps asleep and I was overreacting. But my mind couldn't shake the feeling that I was being kept in this room, isolated and alone. The locked door seemed like a physical barrier, and I felt the absence of control more keenly with each passing moment. I tried to look for a way out, but the only exit was the locked door. The windows didn't open far enough for me to crawl through, and the walls were too high for me to climb. I considered calling the police, but I didn't know if I was just being paranoid. What would I even say? That the door was locked, that Sarah hadn't come to unlock it. I wasn't sure what to do. As I sat on the bed waiting, a strange thought crossed my mind. What if the door wasn't locked by mistake? What if there was a reason behind it? The thought made my stomach churn, but I couldn't ignore it. Something about the situation felt wrong. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Sarah had never locked the door in any of the other rooms I had stayed in before. Why was this room different? Finally, I heard the faint sound of footsteps coming down the hallway. I stood up quickly, hoping it was Sarah. But when I looked through the crack in the door, I saw no one. The footsteps had stopped just outside the room. I tried to open the door again, but the lock wouldn't budge. Panic started to rise in my chest as I realized I might truly be trapped. There was no way out, no one around, and the door remained locked, keeping me in the room, isolated from everything else. I called Sarah one more time, but my phone rang out. I couldn't wait any longer. My heart pounded as I tried to think of a solution. The night felt endless, the walls closing in around me as the silence grew heavier. What had started as a simple mistake had become something far more sinister, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer welcome in that house. Story 18. I had always been close with my cat Bella. She was independent yet affectionate, always coming back home at the same time each evening. But one day she didn't return. I thought she might have wandered off to explore, as she sometimes did. But after a day passed and there was still no sign of her, my worries started to grow. I posted on social media, asking if anyone had seen her, but there were no answers. The next day, I did the same thing, checked around the neighborhood, put up flyers, and called the local shelters. Nothing. It was unlike Bella to stay away for so long. By the second day, I was starting to panic. I couldn't focus at work, constantly checking my phone for updates, hoping someone would call with information. At night, I found it difficult to sleep, wondering where she could be. Did she get trapped somewhere? Was she hurt? The questions kept racing through my mind, each more unsettling than the last. I spent hours combing through the streets, calling her name into the dark, hoping to hear a meow in response, but there was nothing. Then, on the third day, when I had nearly given up hope, I heard a soft meow at the door. I rushed to open it, and there she was, Bella, looking absolutely miserable. Her fur was matted, dirty, and she seemed to be trembling. I knelt down to her, relieved and elated to see her safe, but something about the way she acted immediately struck me as off. She was usually playful and eager for affection when she returned from her little adventures, but this time she was distant, almost as if she didn't want to be touched. I bent down to check her over, worried she might have been in some kind of accident. That's when I noticed the cut. It was deep, running along the side of her leg, just above the paw. The wound was fresh, surrounded by dried blood, and looked as though it had been made by something sharp. I felt a knot form in my stomach. How could she have gotten such a serious injury? And why hadn't she come home sooner to get help? I carefully tried to touch her leg, but she pulled away, letting out a soft hiss, clearly in pain. I immediately grabbed a towel, gently wrapping it around her leg to prevent further injury, and rushed her to the vet. The ride to the clinic was long and quiet. Bella, usually a vocal cat, didn't make a sound. She just sat there, her body tense and rigid, staring at me with wide, fearful eyes. I tried to reassure her, talking softly, but it felt like she was a million miles away. At the vet's office, they immediately took her in, and I was left to sit in the sterile waiting room, my mind spinning with worry. The cut on her leg needed to be cleaned and stitched up, the vet said. But what really concerned her was Bella's overall state. She was trembling uncontrollably, her eyes wide with fear, as if she had just experienced something traumatic. When the vet finished tending to her and brought Bella back to me, I noticed a significant change. Bella wasn't the same cat she had been before. She had always been independent but affectionate, following me around the house and curling up beside me at night. But now, she wouldn't let me out of her sight. Every time I left the room, she would follow me, pacing just a few steps behind. At night, she wouldn't sleep unless I was right next to her. And even then, she would wake up every few minutes, as if she was on high alert. It was as though she couldn't relax, couldn't trust anything or anyone. I tried to comfort her, petting her and whispering softly, but nothing seemed to soothe her. The next few days were a blur of concern and confusion. Bella's behavior became more erratic, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She wasn't just scared, she was acting like something had happened to her, something that had completely shattered her sense of security. I couldn't help but feel that the deep cut on her leg wasn't the worst of it. It was the way she refused to leave my side, her constant need for reassurance, her inability to settle down. It felt like she was haunted by something. One evening, as I was sitting in the living room, Bella suddenly bolted upright from her spot on the couch, her eyes wide and her body tense. She stared at the window, her pupils dilating. I turned to follow her gaze, but there was nothing there. The street was quiet, the neighborhood as peaceful as it had been before. Bella's gaze didn't waver. She was watching something or someone with such intensity that I felt a chill run down my spine. For a moment I thought I imagined it, but when I looked at her again, I could see the terror in her eyes. It wasn't like the playful curiosity she'd had before. This was pure, unadulterated fear. I tried to calm her down, but it was impossible. Bella was still trembling, her body rigid. She refused to sit still, pacing the floor, mewing softly as if she were searching for something. I had no idea what had happened to her in the past few days, but whatever it was, it had clearly left a mark. She wouldn't even go near the door anymore, as if terrified to go outside. She spent most of her time huddled next to me, staying as close as possible, her eyes never leaving the windows or doors. I started to wonder if Bella's disappearance had been a result of something much more sinister. Maybe she had encountered something while she was away, something or someone who had hurt her, or worse, frightened her so badly that she couldn't recover. The deep cut on her leg seemed to be a clue, but I had no way of knowing what had truly happened during those 2 missing days. All I knew was that my cat was not the same, and I didn't know how to help her heal from whatever she had experienced. Story 19. It was late in the evening when I first noticed that something was off with my car. I had parked it on the street right outside my apartment, as I always did. The area was usually quiet, and I never felt uncomfortable leaving my car there overnight. But when I walked out the next morning, I found that the passenger side window had been smashed. It wasn't a large crack, but it was enough to make me hesitate as I approached. I ran my hand over the broken glass and checked inside, half expecting to find some of my belongings missing. But to my surprise, everything seemed untouched. My bag, my work tools, and even the loose change in the cup holder were all still there. No one had taken anything. At first, I thought it was just a random act of vandalism. I'd heard of people breaking into cars just for the thrill of it, even if they didn't steal anything. I figured it was just bad luck, so I made a mental note to call my insurance company to report the damage. As I stood there surveying the scene, I realized something else that didn't sit right with me. The license plate on my car was not the one I remembered. I knelt down to take a closer look, my confusion growing. The plate had a different number combination, one that I definitely hadn't seen before. I ran my fingers over the metal, checking the edges and the screws. There was no sign of forced entry around the plates themselves, but the more I stared at it, the more I was convinced someone had swapped my plates. I stood there for a few moments trying to make sense of it all. How could I have missed it? I usually kept a close eye on my car, especially when it came to details like the license plate. I had always been meticulous about making sure everything was in order, and the idea that someone had switched the plates without me noticing seemed impossible. Had it happened overnight? Or had someone been watching me for a longer period of time? The possibilities felt endless, and none of them made sense. But there was one thing I knew for sure: I needed to get the police involved. I called the non-emergency line and waited for the dispatcher to answer. After explaining the situation, they advised me to file a police report just in case my car had been stolen or involved in some sort of illegal activity. I didn't think my car had been stolen, but I followed their instructions and met an officer at my apartment later that morning. The officer was kind but didn't seem overly concerned at first. After all, there were no signs of theft or forced entry. But when he checked the license plate and noticed it was different, his demeanor changed. He took down my information and assured me that they would look into it. I tried to explain that I had no idea how it had happened, but the more I spoke, the more unsettling the situation became. The officer said it was possible that someone had swapped the plates in an attempt to use my car for something illegal, but there were no immediate signs that the car had been involved in anything suspicious. He advised me to stay in touch with the department and keep an eye out for any unusual activity. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something deeper than just a simple case of vandalism. The next day, I woke up early to check on my car again. I was expecting to find some sort of explanation, but everything appeared normal. The broken window was still there, but the car itself looked the same. No new damage, no new clues. I thought maybe I was just overthinking things. It had been a stressful week, and perhaps my mind was playing tricks on me. I went about my day, trying to ignore the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. But when I got home that evening, I found a message from the police. The officer who had filed my report called to inform me that they had reviewed the surveillance footage from a nearby gas station. They had found a car matching mine with the swapped plates parked outside the station the previous night. According to the footage, the car had been there for several hours before driving off, but no one had gotten out. The officer's voice was calm, but there was an underlying tension in his words. The car had been involved in some sort of criminal activity, but the plates didn't match up with anything on file. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. The thought that my car had been used for something illegal was terrifying. But what was even more unnerving was the realization that the plates had been swapped for a reason. Someone had used my car as a cover, and I had no idea who they were or what they were doing. The officer mentioned that they were running the plates through the system to see if they could track down the vehicle's real owner, but it was clear that this situation was getting more complicated by the minute. Over the next few days, the police conducted an investigation. They found out that the plates on my car were reported as stolen from a car dealership several miles away. The dealer had no record of any stolen cars, and it seemed like the plates had been taken as part of a larger scheme. The officer asked if I had any connections to the dealership or if I knew anyone who might have had access to the plates. I couldn't think of anything or anyone who would be involved in something like that. As the days passed, I began to feel increasingly paranoid. It wasn't just the stolen plates that bothered me, it was the fact that someone had been able to get so close to my life without me realizing it. Who had been watching me, and why? I had no answers. I kept my car locked and parked in a secure lot from that point on, but the lingering feeling of being watched never left. The police never caught the person responsible for swapping the plates, and the case eventually went cold. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. Someone had used my car for something I would never know. And all I was left with was the haunting question, what had they done with it, and would I ever be safe again? Story 20. It was a quiet afternoon when I decided to take a walk through the local park. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the winding paths and the scattered benches. The park was mostly empty, save for a few joggers and a couple of children playing on the swings. I found an empty bench near the large oak tree and sat down, taking a deep breath of the fresh air, appreciating the rare moment of peace. The stillness of the place was soothing, and I felt my tension from the day start to fade away. As I sat there, enjoying the calm, my eyes caught something on the ground near the path. It was a phone, lying face down in the grass. The screen was cracked, and it looked out of place in the otherwise tidy park. I stood up and walked over, wondering who could have dropped it. It wasn't uncommon to see a lost item in the park, but I usually found things like water bottles or a forgotten jacket, never a phone. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should just leave it, but the curiosity got the better of me. I picked up the phone, feeling the weight of it in my hands. It was surprisingly heavy, and I noticed it was still on, despite the cracked screen. I pressed the power button, hoping it would unlock so I could try to find the owner. The phone flickered to life, the screen displaying a picture of what looked like a park, exactly the one I was sitting in. I frowned, unsure of what to make of it. Maybe it was a coincidence, a photo taken at the same spot. I swiped to unlock the phone, and that's when things took a turn. The screen changed in an instant, flashing a series of images so quickly I could barely process them. Each one was more disturbing than the last, bloody, unsettling pictures that seemed to blur together. I saw a dark alley, a shadowy figure standing at the end, its features impossible to make out. Then, a close-up of a pair of eyes, wide open in fear. The next image was of a hand, fingers twitching in what appeared to be a desperate, agonizing motion. I felt my heart race, and I quickly tried to press the power button to turn off the phone, but it wouldn't respond. I frantically swiped the screen, hoping to make the images stop, but instead, they seemed to get worse, The phone flickered again, and now the images were much more graphic. There were disturbing scenes of a person in distress, their face twisted in terror, the background almost indistinguishable from one another. A part of me wanted to drop the phone, to throw it away and forget I had ever seen it. But my hands wouldn't move. I was frozen, watching the screen as it changed with rapid speed, each new image more unsettling than the last. Suddenly the phone went black. I felt a rush of relief as the screen went dark, but it didn't last. The phone buzzed in my hand, and a new message appeared on the screen. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. The message was simple: "You shouldn't have seen that." My stomach dropped. I turned the phone over in my hands, half expecting something to jump out at me. But there was nothing. Just the message, lingering in my mind like a threat I couldn't escape. I was shaken, unsure of what to do next. My first instinct was to throw the phone into the nearest trash can and walk away, but something stopped me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that somehow, whatever was on that phone was meant for me. I stood up, clutching the phone tightly in my hand, and looked around the park. No one seemed to be paying attention, but I couldn't help but feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise. It was as though the entire park had shifted, the quiet and calm now replaced by an unsettling tension. I started walking back toward the entrance of the park, the phone still in my hand, its weight a constant reminder of the images I had just seen. The message kept repeating in my mind, each word echoing like a warning. "You shouldn't have seen that." My footsteps quickened, and my heart began to race again. I wanted to get as far away from the park as possible, but something held me there, something I couldn't explain. It was as if the phone had somehow tethered me to that moment, to those images that haunted me. When I reached the gate, I looked back one last time, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me. But there was no one, just the quiet park, now feeling more ominous than before. I glanced down at the phone once more, my fingers trembling as I held it. Without thinking, I made my decision. I would take it to the police. Maybe they could trace the phone, figure out who it belonged to, and why the images were so disturbing. Maybe they could make sense of the message. I walked to the nearest police station, the phone still in my hand, and explained what had happened. The officers listened intently, but their faces were unreadable. They asked me to hand over the phone so they could examine it. I did, but a nagging feeling tugged at me. What if I had made a mistake? What if the images were meant to be a warning, something I wasn't supposed to understand? What if I had just become part of something much larger than myself? The officer took the phone, and after a few moments he looked up at me, his expression grim. He said they would investigate, but I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He didn't tell me much, but his reaction spoke volumes. As I left the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, a presence that wasn't quite there but still palpable. And when I got home that night, I couldn't help but glance at my phone, half expecting another message to appear, warning me again. The phone never returned to me, and the police never gave me any answers. But I haven't been able to shake the feeling that whatever I saw on that screen was just the beginning of something I was never meant to witness. Story 21. For weeks, my phone had been ringing at all hours, always from a private number. At first, I thought it was just a telemarketer or some wrong number, but the calls kept coming, persistent and strange. Every time I answered, there was nothing but silence on the other end, like the person on the other line was just waiting. I'd hang up each time, frustrated and confused, but the calls would continue, almost as if someone knew I would pick up and leave the phone to ring again. The silence became unnerving. I stopped answering after the third or fourth call, convinced it was just some strange prank or a glitch in the system. But the fact that they kept coming, day after day, began to gnaw at me. Sometimes I'd glance at my phone in the middle of the night, seeing the missed call from a private number, and my heart would skip a beat. It was as though the unknown caller was always there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. One evening, after a particularly long day, my phone rang again. This time I didn't hesitate. I picked it up, almost out of habit, half expecting the usual silence. But this time it was different. There was a low, heavy breathing on the other end. The kind of breath that felt too close, as though someone was standing right next to me, just listening. I froze, my throat tightening as I held the phone to my ear, waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. The breathing continued, slow and deliberate, each inhale dragging on longer than the last. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, the weight of the sound pressing against my chest. The longer it went on, the more I felt a growing sense of dread creeping into my bones. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what was happening, but nothing made sense. Was it a prank? A sick joke? I wanted to hang up, but I couldn't. Something kept me rooted to the spot, my fingers gripping the phone tightly. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. "Hello," I croaked, my voice trembling. There was no response. The breathing didn't stop. It only grew louder, heavier, as though the person on the other end was getting closer. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else, and I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I tried again, louder this time, my voice trembling with panic. "Who is this?" I demanded. Still nothing but the heavy breathing. My grip tightened around the phone, and I could feel my pulse racing. The air in the room felt thick, as though I couldn't breathe in the same space as this person anymore. The feeling of being trapped, of being hunted, washed over me. There was no escape from the oppressive silence and the strange presence on the other end. The seconds felt like hours, each breath from the caller slicing through the tension in the room. Suddenly, I couldn't take it anymore. My fear reached a boiling point, and I screamed into the phone, "Stop. Stop it." It was a guttural scream, the kind of sound that comes from the deepest place of terror. I expected the call to end, or for the person to speak, to give me some explanation. But the moment I screamed, the breathing stopped abruptly. The line went dead, not a click, not a dial tone, just silence. I stared at the phone in disbelief, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. I slowly lowered the phone, feeling the weight of the silence press against me. The air around me felt heavy, like the room had somehow changed. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just a glitch, that maybe the caller had just hung up. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I couldn't stop thinking about the call. The way the breathing had sounded so real, so close. I replayed the scene in my mind, trying to make sense of it. But each time I did, the fear only grew. It was impossible to ignore the sensation that someone somewhere was watching me. That thought gnawed at me long after I had put the phone down. I hadn't felt safe in my own home since the calls started, but now, with that strange call, it felt like the walls were closing in. The next day, I found myself constantly glancing at my phone, half expecting another call from the same private number. I couldn't shake the feeling that the person who had been breathing on the other end wasn't done with me. It had become a part of my daily routine to check the missed calls, but they never came. Day after day, I'd glance at my phone, and there would be nothing. The silence became deafening, and I couldn't escape the sense of impending danger that hung over me. A week passed, and the calls stopped. Just like that, they vanished. No more private numbers, no more eerie breathing. It was almost a relief, like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I thought I could finally move on, forget about the strange calls that had haunted me, but the relief didn't last. It was one evening, when I was sitting in the living room, that I noticed it again, a faint, almost imperceptible sound coming from the other room. It sounded like breathing, soft at first, then growing louder. I didn't need to check my phone to know what was happening. The same fear I had felt before returned, flooding me in an instant. I stood frozen, staring at the door, the sound growing louder, closer. The same deep, labored breaths from before, as if someone was standing just beyond the door, waiting for me to make the next move. I swallowed hard, knowing that whatever this was, it wasn't over. Story 22. The sun had just dipped below the horizon as I started my drive home from work. It had been a long, exhausting day, and I was looking forward to the quiet of my apartment and the comfort of a warm meal. The streets were relatively empty, save for the occasional car, but something felt off. I noticed, almost immediately, that a car had started following me. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, but as I turned left onto a side street, the car turned with me. I glanced in my rearview mirror, trying to get a better look at the car, but all I could see were the headlights. The vehicle seemed to be maintaining a steady distance, not too close, but definitely not far enough to be normal. My heart rate increased, a sense of unease creeping over me as I turned another corner. It was late, and I knew the area wasn't well lit. My mind raced with all sorts of scenarios. Maybe it was just someone heading in the same direction, but why was the car mimicking my every move? I sped up, hoping to create some distance, but the car behind me stayed right on my tail. No matter how fast I went, it seemed to match my speed. A knot tightened in my stomach. I had the strange feeling that the driver was deliberately keeping up with me, almost as if they were trying to make sure I didn't lose them. I made another turn, this time onto an unfamiliar street, hoping it would throw them off. But to my growing terror, the car followed me again, its headlights glaring through my rearview mirror. Panic set in. I knew I couldn't just keep driving forever. I was getting farther from home, the streets becoming quieter and more desolate. The car behind me hadn't wavered once. I took another random turn, trying to make sure I wasn't being too predictable, but the car kept its distance, just enough to remain in my rear view but not too close to be immediately threatening. I could feel my heart racing, my palms sweating as I gripped the steering wheel tighter. I pulled onto a street that seemed even more isolated, hoping to lose the car. But every time I glanced in my rearview mirror, it was still there, like a shadow following me. My mind screamed for me to stop, to call the police. But I didn't want to give the car any reason to stop with me. I continued driving, making random turns and hoping that this time I could get away. But nothing worked. The car was relentless. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. My nerves were frayed and I was beginning to fear for my safety. I pulled over to the side of the road, parking my car on the shoulder. The street was dark, and the only sound was the soft hum of the engine. I quickly fumbled for my phone, hands shaking as I dialed the police. I told them everything, the car that had been following me, how I'd tried losing it, and how it just wouldn't leave me alone. As I waited for the police to arrive, my eyes darted from my rearview mirror to the road behind me. The car had stopped as well, just a few yards down the road. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the headlights, not knowing if the driver would get out and approach me. Every second felt like an eternity. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. What if they were waiting for me to get out of my car? What if they wanted to confront me? Minutes passed, and still the car didn't move. It just sat there, its headlights shining, its engine idling. I kept my phone pressed to my ear, listening to the calm voice of the dispatcher telling me help was on the way. Every minute felt like an hour. I watched the car in my mirror, expecting it to suddenly start moving toward me. But instead, the unexpected happened. Without warning, the car's headlights flickered, then dimmed. The engine revved once, then the car started to move, pulling away slowly. I watched frozen in place as the car drove off into the darkness. A wave of relief washed over me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Why had they left? Why had they waited until I called the police to leave? I still had no answers, only the unnerving sense that the entire situation had been deliberately staged. I stayed in my car, my phone still clutched tightly in my hand, my eyes never leaving the rearview mirror. I didn't move until the police finally arrived, their sirens a welcome sound in the otherwise silent street. When they pulled up beside me, I quickly explained everything, my voice shaky from the anxiety that had built up over the last hour. They took down my information, but after checking the area, they couldn't find anything. No sign of the car, no suspicious activity. It was as if the car had disappeared. The officers reassured me that I had done the right thing by calling them and advised me to stay cautious. They couldn't find any reason for the car to have been following me, but they offered to patrol the area a bit longer. As I drove away, I felt the weight of the incident settle on my shoulders. The unsettling feeling didn't fade, and even though the streets were quiet again, my mind couldn't stop replaying the event. Why had that car followed me? Who was the driver, and what did they want? I tried to shake off the lingering fear as I drove home, but the image of the headlights in my rearview mirror stayed with me. It was impossible to let go of the sense that something more had been at play, something I would never understand. And every time I drove down that same stretch of road in the days that followed, I couldn't help but glance in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see those same headlights following me once more. Story 23. It was a cold, crisp afternoon when I found the wallet on the sidewalk. I had just left the coffee shop and was making my way home when something on the ground caught my eye. It was an old, leather wallet, worn with age but still intact. I hesitated for a moment, wondering whether I should pick it up or leave it, but curiosity got the best of me and I knelt down to grab it. The wallet felt surprisingly heavy in my hands, like it contained more than just cash and cards. I flipped it open to check for an ID, thinking I could return it to its rightful owner. As I flipped through the contents, I found the usual assortment: a few crumpled bills, a couple of credit cards, and some loose change. But at the very bottom of the wallet, underneath everything, was a folded piece of paper. I pulled the note out slowly, my fingers trembling slightly. It wasn't a receipt or a grocery list, but something much more unsettling. The paper was old, frayed at the edges, and the handwriting was messy, almost hurried. My eyes scanned the note, and my heart skipped a beat when I read the words written in dark ink. "I know who you are. I know where you live." I froze. The words seemed to burn themselves into my mind, and I had to reread them twice before I could process what they meant. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as a chill ran through me. What did this note mean? Who wrote it? And why was it inside a wallet I'd just found on the sidewalk? The normal world I had known just moments before felt distant, like it had shifted, and something darker was creeping in. I quickly glanced around, half expecting someone to be watching me, but the street was quiet. No one seemed to notice or care about the wallet I had just picked up. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, like I had stumbled into something I wasn't supposed to see. I stood up, clutching the wallet in my hand, and hurriedly looked for any signs that someone was nearby, but the street remained eerily empty. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do next. Should I call the police? Should I just ignore the note and leave the wallet behind? My thoughts were clouded with fear and uncertainty. I had no idea what this note meant, but it felt like a warning, as if someone out there knew things about me that they shouldn't. The thought of someone watching me, knowing where I lived, sent a wave of panic through me. After a few moments of indecision, I shoved the wallet into my bag and walked quickly home. My mind raced the entire way, replaying the words on the note over and over again. I know who you are. I know where you live. They haunted me, making it impossible to focus on anything else. My heart pounded in my chest, and every shadow seemed to hold the potential for danger. When I got home, I locked the door behind me, the feeling of safety fleeting at best. I set the wallet down on the table and stared at it, almost afraid to open it again. What was I supposed to do with it? I thought about the possibility that it could belong to someone who was now looking for it, but the note made that seem unlikely. No one would write something like that unless they had a reason to be scared of something or someone. I couldn't ignore the knot in my stomach. I had to figure out what to do with the wallet, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. Instead, I pulled the wallet open again and took another look inside, this time more carefully. There was no ID, no name, no address, nothing that could point to the owner. The cards inside were all blank, with no distinguishing features. The only clue that remained was the note, and that was what terrified me the most. I considered calling the police, but what could I possibly tell them? A wallet with a strange note inside. Would they believe me? I wasn't even sure I believed what I had read. The note could have been a prank, some twisted joke left behind for someone like me to find. But deep down, I knew it felt too real. I felt a strange sense of dread settling into my bones, like I had just uncovered something that was meant to stay hidden. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of light from the street lamps outside had my mind racing. I kept replaying the note in my head, wondering if I had somehow missed something, some clue that would make sense of it all. What did the person who wrote it want from me? And why had they chosen me? The next morning, I tried to go about my day as usual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I walked around my apartment, checking the locks on the doors and windows, wondering if I was being watched. It seemed ridiculous, but the sense of paranoia wouldn't leave me. I even thought I saw someone standing on the street corner across from my building, staring up at my window, but when I looked again, there was no one there. Days passed, and I did my best to go about my life, but the note and the wallet haunted me. I never saw anything that would confirm my worst fears, but the nagging feeling that I was being watched never quite went away. The more I tried to ignore it, the stronger the feeling became. I couldn't forget about the note, or the idea that someone knew things about me that they shouldn't. Eventually, I decided to go back to the spot where I had found the wallet, hoping to see anything that might explain what had happened. I retraced my steps, scanning the ground, but there was nothing. No trace of the wallet or anything that could give me a clue. It was as though the whole thing had been a bizarre, unsettling dream. Yet the note, tucked away in the wallet, was all too real. I returned home that day with a sense of dread still hanging over me. I still didn't know who had left the note or why they had chosen me. But one thing was clear: I would never be able to shake the feeling that I was being watched, no matter how hard I tried. And until I figured out the truth, I couldn't escape the fear that it would all catch up to me. Story 24. It started with a single text message. It was late, around midnight, when I heard my phone buzz on the nightstand beside me. I had just finished reading a book and was preparing to turn in for the night. My eyes were heavy, but when I glanced at the screen, the words were unsettling. "I'm watching you." The message came from an unknown number, no name, no profile picture, just a blank, anonymous sender. At first I shrugged it off as some kind of prank or wrong number. But then, the second message came through just a few minutes later. "I'm closer than you think," it read. My heart skipped a beat. I sat up in bed, my mind racing. There was no mistaking it, this was no random text. Someone had deliberately sent it to me, and whoever they were, they knew exactly how to get under my skin. I scanned my apartment, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway or hiding in the shadows, but there was nothing. I tried to ignore it. After all, there was no way someone could be watching me from the outside. I lived in a fairly quiet neighborhood, and the streetlights outside my window barely cast enough light to make out any details. But the more I thought about the message, the more it bothered me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Who would send such a cryptic message, and why me? As the night wore on, I couldn't get back to sleep. I stared at the ceiling, the words "I'm closer than you think" echoing in my mind. I tried to convince myself it was just some sick joke, but the uncertainty gnawed at me. Could someone really be watching me? My phone buzzed again, pulling me from my thoughts. This time the message was even more chilling. "I see you." I jumped out of bed and rushed to the window, pulling the blinds aside to peer outside. The street was still empty, the soft glow of the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. I tried to calm myself down. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe it was just a prankster playing games. But my heart was pounding, and every little noise seemed amplified in the silence of the night. The texts kept coming, one after another, each one more unsettling than the last. "I know where you live," the next one said. "I'm closer than you think," followed shortly after. The next text was even more specific. "I can hear you breathing." Panic began to set in. Who was doing this? And why were they targeting me? I felt completely exposed, vulnerable, like someone was lurking just beyond the walls of my apartment. I tried to call the police, but every time I reached for my phone to dial 911, I hesitated. There was no evidence of anything concrete. No one had broken into my apartment. There were no footprints outside my window. I had no way of proving that someone was watching me. But the texts were getting more frequent, more personal. "I see the light in your living room." "I'm watching from the window across the street," one text read. My hands shook as I read the words. I rushed to the window again, this time peering through the blinds more carefully, but saw nothing. No movement, no shadow, just the empty street. It wasn't until I received the final text that the full weight of the situation hit me. The message read, "I'm at your front door." My heart stopped. I turned and looked toward the door, my pulse quickening. It was impossible. There was no one at my door. No knocks, no sounds of footsteps approaching. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The world outside felt unnervingly silent. My phone buzzed again, and I hesitated before unlocking it, my stomach turning with dread. The screen lit up with a new message, but this one was different. It wasn't just a text. It was a photo. I stared at the image, my blood running cold. It was a picture of my house taken from across the street. I could see the glow of my living room light through the window. The exact same light that had been on when I was sitting there just moments before. The photo wasn't a random shot, it was focused. The angle was perfect, and it was taken recently. I recognized the view. This wasn't an old photo. Someone had been outside my house watching me. I was paralyzed with fear. My thoughts raced, and I felt the walls of my apartment closing in around me. I had to do something. I had to get out of there. But as I grabbed my keys and rushed toward the door, the phone buzzed again. "You can't run. I know where you'll go," the message said. I froze, my hand still on the doorknob. My mind was spinning. How could they know? How could anyone know? I had no idea how long this person had been watching me, or how they had gotten so close. The only thing I knew for sure was that I wasn't safe. I couldn't stay here anymore. I backed away from the door and grabbed my phone, dialing 911 without thinking. My voice was shaky as I explained everything: the texts, the photo, the feeling of being watched. The dispatcher promised help was on the way. But as I sat in my living room, staring at my phone in my trembling hands, I felt more alone than ever. It was as if the walls of my own home had become a cage, trapping me inside with an invisible stalker. The minutes felt like hours as I waited for the police to arrive. Each buzz of my phone made my heart leap in my chest, but no new messages came through. The silence was suffocating. And just as I thought I might be able to breathe again, the doorbell rang. I froze, my blood turning to ice. Could it really be the police? Or was it someone else, someone who had been waiting for this moment? I couldn't bring myself to answer the door. The silence stretched on until the sound of footsteps slowly faded away. Story 25. It was one of those nights when the air felt heavy with stillness, and the streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement. I had just finished a late shift at the diner and was walking home, the familiar route winding through quiet streets. My footsteps echoed in the silence, and the occasional car passing by was the only sound to break the calm. The neighborhood felt unusually deserted, almost like everyone had disappeared, leaving me alone with my thoughts. As I approached the corner of Maple and 7th, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. Standing on the side of the road, barely illuminated by the dim glow of the streetlight, was a dog. It wasn't moving, just standing there, its gaze fixed directly on me. It was a strange sight, something about the way it stood so still, like it was waiting for me to notice it. I couldn't make out its breed, but the eyes were the most striking feature, wide and unblinking, staring into mine as though it knew something I didn't. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. I'd passed stray dogs before, and most of the time they were skittish, darting away at the sound of footsteps. But this one was different. There was no growling, no wagging tail, just that unyielding stare. A sense of unease crept over me, and without thinking I crossed the street to avoid getting too close. I told myself it was just a dog, nothing to worry about, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. When I reached the opposite sidewalk, I glanced over my shoulder. To my surprise, the dog had crossed the street as well, maintaining its position on the other side, still watching me intently. It hadn't made a sound or moved from its spot, but somehow it had managed to follow my every step. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickened my pace, hoping to get home faster. But the dog continued its slow, deliberate walk across the street, never taking its eyes off me. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe the dog lived nearby, and I was merely crossing its path. But with each step I took, the sensation of being followed grew stronger. Every time I glanced over, the dog was still there, now a few paces behind, never getting too close but never falling behind either. Its steady pace mirrored mine, like a shadow that wouldn't leave me alone. The further I walked, the more uncomfortable I became. The street seemed eerily quiet, and the dog's presence felt increasingly unnatural. It was as if it was keeping pace with me on purpose, as though it had all the time in the world to follow. There were no other pedestrians around, No other cars passing by, just the steady rhythm of my own footsteps and the occasional scrape of the dog's paws on the pavement. After a few more blocks, I took a sharp turn down a side street, hoping to shake this strange dog off. I looked back, expecting it to be gone, but there it was still on the other side of the street, still watching me. The night seemed to stretch on, the silence between us growing thicker. I couldn't explain why, but I felt an increasing sense of dread, as if something wasn't right. I had never felt so aware of my surroundings, as though every step, every breath was being observed by something beyond my control. The air felt colder now, and the dog's unblinking gaze was almost too much to bear. It wasn't just a dog, it felt like an omen, like something was waiting for me to make a mistake. My breath quickened, and I instinctively checked over my shoulder again. There was no mistaking it, the dog hadn't stopped. It had crossed the street again, mirroring my every movement as if it had been waiting for this moment. At that point, I was sure I couldn't take it anymore. My heart was pounding, my mind racing for an explanation. Maybe it was a stray, or perhaps it was following me for food, but it didn't feel like that. It felt deliberate, intentional. As I reached the next intersection, I turned sharply into another side street, determined to finally lose it. This time I kept my head down, walking briskly, praying that when I looked back, the dog would be gone. I reached the end of the block and looked over my shoulder once more, half expecting to see those eyes still watching me. But there was no sign of the dog. The street was empty, as if it had vanished into thin air. I stood there for a moment, heart still racing, trying to convince myself that it had just been a strange coincidence, that my mind had played tricks on me in the quiet of the night. But even as I stood there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, something that wasn't ready to let me go. I turned the corner and made my way home, the familiar sight of my building offering a small comfort. As I entered the lobby, I felt a brief sense of relief wash over me. It was over. The strange dog, whatever its purpose had been, was no longer in my thoughts. But just as I stepped into the elevator, I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection of the metal doors, a shadow. It was fleeting, but I could have sworn I saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me, watching me even as I tried to escape. I pressed the button for my floor and stood in silence, waiting for the elevator to carry me to safety. But the image of those eyes, the dog that had followed me for blocks without a sound, stayed with me long after the doors closed. I didn't know if I would ever truly understand what happened that night, but the unease lingered, as if the dog had been a part of something bigger, something that had been following me all along. Story 26. My neighbor had always been a bit of a mystery. They moved into the house a few months ago, a small, modest place right next to mine, and kept to themselves ever since. At first, I didn't think much of it. Some people just like their privacy, and I figured they were one of those types. But over the weeks, I began to notice certain oddities. They were never seen outside, unless it was very late at night or early in the morning, and when they did venture out, it was usually in a hurry, as if they were avoiding attention. One evening I was sitting on my porch, enjoying the cool breeze, when I noticed the lights flickering in their house. It was a strange thing to see, especially at that hour. The glow from their windows would dim and brighten intermittently, as though someone was messing with the light switches. I watched for a while, wondering if it was a problem with the power lines, but the rest of the neighborhood seemed fine. Curiosity gnawed at me. I'd always been the kind of person to mind my own business, but something about this felt off. Maybe it was just the isolation I'd felt in my own life lately, or maybe there was something more to this situation. After a few minutes of watching the lights flicker, I decided to go over and check on them. I figured it would be harmless, just a quick knock to make sure everything was okay. I didn't want to be a nosy neighbor, but I'd seen them come and go enough times to know they were rarely around when I was, and this seemed like an opportunity to make sure they weren't in trouble or need of help. With a sigh, I stood up from my porch swing and crossed the short distance to their front door, my footsteps quiet on the cracked sidewalk. When I arrived at their door, I paused for a moment, unsure if I should knock. What if they didn't want to be bothered? I hadn't spoken to them more than a handful of times, and each time they had been short and distant. Still, the flickering lights made me uneasy, and I figured it wouldn't hurt to ask if everything was all right. I raised my hand and knocked softly. There was no answer. I waited a moment and then knocked again, a little louder this time. The silence that followed seemed to stretch on, and a sense of unease began to settle over me. As I stood there, I noticed that the door, just slightly ajar, suddenly creaked open on its own. I froze, not sure what to make of it. It wasn't fully open, but wide enough for me to see the faint outline of what lay inside. It was strange that the door had opened so easily. I hadn't heard anyone approach, and yet there it was, inviting me in. My heart beat faster as I looked around, half expecting someone to rush out and greet me, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no movement, just the eerie quiet that had settled over the house. A wave of anxiety washed over me as I hesitated. Should I go in? Was it even safe? I had no reason to believe there was anything dangerous inside, but something about the situation felt wrong. I had always been a believer in trusting my gut, and in this moment, every instinct I had screamed at me to turn around and leave. But the curiosity in me, something I had always struggled with, pushed me forward. I took a tentative step toward the door and called out softly, "Hello, is anyone home?" There was no response. The only sound was the faint creak of the door swinging slightly in the breeze. I took another step and peered into the dim hallway beyond. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. My eyes adjusted to the low light as I stepped inside. The air was thick, and there was an unpleasant smell lingering in the space. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was strange, something musty and stale, like the smell of old, neglected furniture. The smell grew stronger as I ventured deeper into the house, making my throat tighten. It was almost as if the house hadn't been lived in for a long time. The living room was empty, save for the piles of boxes stacked against the walls. They were old, dusty, and covered in thick layers of grime, as if they had been there for months. The furniture that had once filled the space was gone, leaving only empty floorboards behind. There was no sign of life, no photographs, no personal items, nothing to suggest anyone had ever called this place home. My mind raced. Where had they gone? How could someone move in only to vanish like this? There were no moving trucks outside, no signs of people coming or going. It didn't make sense. I walked further into the house, my steps careful and deliberate. The smell grew worse as I entered the kitchen, and I gagged slightly, trying to ignore the bile rising in my throat. The counters were bare, save for a few old newspapers and more boxes piled up in the corner. A strange sense of unease hung in the air, as though the house itself was holding its breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to be here, that something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. As I explored further, I came across the bathroom, which was equally unsettling. It was small and unremarkable, with a cracked mirror hanging on the wall and a few empty shelves. But what caught my attention was the faint trace of a footprint in the dust on the floor, leading from the door to the bathtub. The dust around the print was undisturbed, as if someone had walked through recently, but had been careful not to leave any other marks behind. My stomach churned as I turned around, the oppressive silence of the house weighing heavily on me. I didn't know how much more I could take. It was as if the house had been abandoned in a hurry, yet there was no sign of a struggle, no signs of people coming and going. The more I looked around, the more the feeling of dread grew. The house felt wrong, like something had happened here, something I couldn't understand. I took one last look around, my heart pounding in my chest. The door was still open, and the smell lingered in the air as I stepped back into the hallway. I left the house as quickly as I could, my mind racing with questions. What had happened to my neighbor? Why had they vanished so suddenly, leaving everything behind? And why did the house feel so empty, even though it seemed as though someone had lived there just a short time ago? I didn't know the answers, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just stumbled upon something far darker than I had ever expected, something that had been hidden away for far too long. Story 27. I had just returned from the grocery store, carrying a bag of fresh produce and essentials. It had been an ordinary shopping trip, and as I set everything down on the kitchen counter, I began to unpack. I reached into my wallet, pulling out the cash I had withdrawn earlier in the day to pay for the groceries. As I counted the bills, I noticed something strange. A $100 bill was missing. At first I thought I might have misplaced it, so I double-checked the wallet and the counter. But the $100 was nowhere to be found. I retraced my steps, wondering if I had dropped it on the way home, or maybe forgotten it at the store. But I quickly dismissed that idea. No one else had been in my apartment except for me. The front door had been locked when I got back, and there was no sign of forced entry. The thought that someone had taken it while I was busy putting away groceries seemed impossible, but the missing bill was undeniable. I sat down at the kitchen table, feeling a strange unease. It wasn't just the money, it was the fact that I couldn't explain what had happened to it. I had been careful with my cash all day. When I first got home, I had even placed the $100 bill on the counter next to the other bills to make sure I didn't forget it. But now it was gone, and there was no logical reason for it. My mind raced as I tried to think of any possible explanation. Had I left it in the grocery store? Could I have accidentally dropped it while getting out of the car? I spent the next few hours scanning every inch of my apartment, checking under the couch cushions, peeking behind furniture, and sifting through the trash just in case the bill had somehow slipped into a bag. There was no trace of it. Nothing. I even checked my wallet again as if it would magically appear inside, but it was still the same. The only other possibility was that someone had somehow snuck in and taken it, but that idea didn't make sense. I hadn't heard anyone, and there were no signs of a break-in. The apartment was as quiet and secure as it had been when I first arrived home. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was probably just a mistake. Maybe I had been distracted, and the $100 bill had slipped out of sight while I was unloading the groceries. But the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. The bill hadn't just vanished on its own. Something about the whole situation felt off, as though there was a reason it had disappeared. It was like the kind of thing that happens in a movie, a small, inexplicable mystery that could be easily dismissed but gnaws at you until you start questioning everything. That night, I decided to sleep on it. Maybe I would find the bill tomorrow, or maybe it would just turn up when I wasn't looking for it. But as I lay in bed, the missing $100 bill kept me awake. I kept imagining all sorts of scenarios, trying to come up with a plausible explanation, but each one felt more unlikely than the last. It was a simple piece of money, and yet It had become the focal point of my thoughts, overshadowing everything else in my life. I couldn't shake the feeling that something strange had happened, something beyond a simple mistake. The next morning, I decided to go through the apartment one more time, thoroughly checking every drawer, shelf, and cabinet. I didn't expect to find anything, but I had to be sure. As I was going through the kitchen drawers, I heard a faint sound of soft rustling, as though something had shifted. My heart skipped a beat, and I stopped in my tracks. It was the kind of sound that could easily be ignored, but in the quiet of the apartment, it felt unsettling. I turned around, scanning the room, but there was nothing out of place. I felt silly standing there, wondering if I had heard something or if my mind was just playing tricks on me. But the moment I turned back to the drawer, I froze. Something was different. The drawer I had just checked moments before now seemed slightly open, a little wider than it had been. I hadn't touched it since I last closed it. My hand trembled as I pulled it open again, and that's when I saw it. There, wedged between two old receipts, was the $100 bill. I stared at it, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. The bill wasn't there before. I had checked the drawer carefully, and it was empty. It was as if the bill had materialized out of nowhere. My first thought was that someone had been in my apartment, after all, someone who had taken the bill and then returned it. But how could that be? I had been home the entire time, and I hadn't heard a thing. No one had come in or left. I closed the drawer quickly, a sense of unease creeping back into my chest. There was no explanation for it. The bill wasn't just lost, it had been taken, or it had disappeared, only to reappear moments later in the most unlikely of places. I thought back to the sound I had heard earlier, the faint rustling that seemed to come from nowhere. Could it have been the bill shifting in the drawer, or was it something else entirely? My mind spun with the possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. That afternoon, I decided to check the locks on the doors and windows just to reassure myself. Everything was secure, as it always was. I still couldn't explain how the $100 bill had gone missing, or how it had reappeared. But one thing was certain: I could no longer shake the feeling that something was off. The mystery of the missing cash was small in the grand scheme of things, but it had left me with a sense of unease that I couldn't ignore. There was something about it that didn't sit right, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Story 28. It was well past midnight when I pulled into the parking garage, the dim lights overhead flickering sporadically. The lot was nearly empty, with only a few cars scattered across the vast concrete expanse. I had just finished a late meeting at work, and was eager to get home, the exhaustion of the day creeping up on me. As I parked my car, I couldn't help but notice a figure standing near the back of my vehicle, their silhouette barely visible under the harsh garage lights. At first, I thought it was just someone walking by or another car pulling into a spot. But as I looked again, I realized the figure wasn't moving. They were standing completely still, just a few feet away from my car. My stomach twisted with unease. The figure was dressed in dark clothes, their face obscured by shadows, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me. I quickly turned off the engine and grabbed my bag, trying to remain calm. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks. Parking garages were rarely populated at this time of night, and I had always parked here before without incident. Still, I felt an odd pressure in the air, like something was off. I took a deep breath and exited the car, my eyes glancing at the figure one more time. They hadn't moved, but I felt their presence, as if they were somehow aware of me, waiting for me to make the next move. I started walking toward the elevator, trying to stay relaxed, but the feeling of being watched intensified with each step. I could hear the echo of my footsteps against the concrete floor, and I was suddenly very aware of how alone I was in the garage. The figure hadn't budged. They were still standing by my car, and I couldn't shake the thought that they were waiting for me to make a mistake. My breath hitched, and I quickened my pace, trying to appear as calm and composed as possible. Then, as if on cue, I heard it, the sound of footsteps behind me, slow but deliberate, growing louder with each passing second. My heart skipped a beat, and a cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. The figure was moving. My legs froze for a split second as I heard their footsteps getting closer, too close for comfort. I told myself it was just another person walking to their car, but my instincts told me something else. Something wasn't right. I fought to stay calm, focusing on the sound of my own feet hitting the ground, trying to drown out the footsteps trailing behind me. The door to the elevator was just a few steps away, but it felt like an eternity as the footsteps grew louder, closer. I risked a glance over my shoulder, my stomach lurching when I saw the figure moving quickly toward me. They were getting closer, far too close. Panic set in and I broke into a fast walk, praying I'd reach the elevator before they caught up to me. The air in the garage seemed to thicken with tension, and my pulse pounded in my ears. I heard the figure's footsteps behind me, now unmistakably faster, almost as if they were running. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be happening. Was it just a coincidence that they were following me? Or was this something far worse? My legs were burning with the effort of walking faster, but the door to the elevator was still too far away. Just as I reached the door, my fingers fumbled with the button to call the elevator. The footsteps were now almost at my back, too close, too loud. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as a chill ran down my spine. I turned around. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was only a few feet away, their face still hidden in the shadows, but I could feel their eyes on me, cold and unblinking. The elevator finally arrived with a soft ding and I shoved the door open, nearly stumbling inside. I pressed the button for the lobby with trembling hands, and the door slid shut behind me with an almost satisfying click. The tension in my body didn't dissipate, though. I could still feel the figure's presence, as if they were right outside the elevator door. The soft hum of the elevator as it moved upward was the only sound in the otherwise silent garage. I stared at the reflection of my wide-eyed face in the elevator door, my pulse still racing, and my mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Who was that person? What did they want? And why did they follow me so closely? The elevator reached the lobby floor, and the doors slid open. I stepped out quickly, glancing over my shoulder one last time to make sure I wasn't being followed. The garage was empty, eerily quiet. The figure was gone. I made my way to the exit, my steps quick and purposeful, but the feeling of dread still lingered in my chest. As I left the building and stepped into the cool night air, I felt a strange mix of relief and fear. My car was parked just a short walk away, and I hurried toward it, glancing around nervously. My fingers fumbled with the keys as I unlocked the door, getting in and locking it behind me as fast as I could. As I drove away, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see the figure in the distance, following me. But there was nothing, just the empty road behind me. The darkness outside seemed to swallow the light from my headlights, and the feeling of being followed didn't ease. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every corner hiding something I couldn't see. I tried to push it from my mind, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But deep down, I knew I wouldn't forget the feeling of those footsteps behind me, growing louder with each step, closer with each passing second. Story 29. I had just replaced the lock on my back door a few days before. The old one had been acting up for weeks, sometimes refusing to latch properly, and other times jamming completely. After a few frustrating attempts to fix it myself, I finally decided to call in a professional to replace it. The new lock seemed solid, and I felt a sense of relief knowing that my home would be secure once again. I didn't think much of it until that night. It was late when I returned home from work. The streets were quiet, the kind of night that makes everything feel like it's at peace. I was tired, ready to relax, but as soon as I approached the back door, I felt a strange sense of unease. The door was wide open. I stopped in my tracks. My heart started to race. It wasn't just ajar. It was completely open. My mind raced to figure out how it could have happened. I was sure I had locked it before leaving, but there it was, hanging wide open as though someone had just walked out. I cautiously stepped inside, my eyes scanning the dimly lit hallway. Everything seemed normal at first glance. The lights were off and the air felt still, almost unnaturally so. I hesitated at the threshold, trying to listen for any sounds, any signs that someone might still be inside. I couldn't hear anything. The silence was unsettling. I stepped further inside, making my way to the back door, which I had to close immediately. The cold night air wafted in, sending a chill through me. The lock was broken again. I stared at it for a long moment, my mind unable to comprehend what I was seeing. The mechanism that had been installed just days ago was no longer intact. The bolt had been forced, and the locking mechanism was twisted at an odd angle, as if someone had pried it open. It looked as though someone had been inside, but nothing appeared to be missing. There was no sign of a break-in, no valuables taken. The kitchen, the living room, everything seemed undisturbed. I walked through the house, inspecting every room carefully. The only thing out of place was the broken lock. I immediately checked the windows, but they were all secure. No signs of forced entry through any other point. I was starting to feel a sense of dread settle in my chest. It was as if someone had gotten in just to send a message, not to steal anything, but to make their presence known. I checked my phone to see if anyone had come by to visit or perhaps left a message. Nothing. My mind kept circling back to the lock. How had it been broken so easily? And why was there no evidence of anything stolen or disturbed? The next day I called the locksmith who had replaced the old lock. He came by to inspect the door, and he confirmed that the lock had been tampered with. But it didn't make sense to him either. The new lock was high quality, designed to resist tampering. The locksmith even tried to explain how someone could have picked the lock or bypassed it, but nothing seemed to add up. The lock had been forcibly damaged, but not in a way that seemed consistent with a professional break-in. It was more like someone had been trying to make a point. I spent the next few days on edge. I kept the doors locked, double-checked the windows, and made sure to leave a light on when I went out. But it was the constant feeling of being watched that unnerved me the most. I couldn't shake the sensation that someone had been in my house, watching me, knowing that I was unaware of their presence. The thoughts began to spiral. Had someone been inside when I wasn't home? Or had they been there just to mess with me, knowing they could come and go without leaving a trace? After a few days, I decided to install a security camera near the back door. It wasn't much, just a small, simple camera with motion detection. I hoped it would give me some peace of mind, or at least capture something that could explain the situation. That night, I sat on the couch, watching the camera feed on my phone. It was quiet, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But around 3 a.m., something strange happened. The camera detected movement. I pulled up the feed on my phone and watched, my breath caught in my throat. The back door opened slowly, and a figure stepped inside. I couldn't make out details, just the outline of a person moving cautiously into the house. I froze, watching in disbelief as the figure stood for a moment in the doorway, as though they were scanning the room. Then, the person moved further into the house, disappearing from view. The door was left wide open again. I didn't know what to think. My first instinct was to call the police, but then I hesitated. Whoever this person was, they had already been in my house once. What were they after? I didn't sleep much that night, too consumed by the thought of someone being inside my house, moving around undetected. The next morning I reviewed the footage again, but this time I saw something I hadn't noticed before. The figure didn't just enter the house, they seemed to be looking for something. They moved around the living room, touching objects, peering into drawers, but not taking anything. The camera feed was grainy, so I couldn't make out any distinguishing features. But it was enough to confirm that this wasn't just a random intruder. The police arrived later that morning after I called them about the footage. They reviewed the video, and the officer who spoke to me seemed concerned but confused. There was no clear evidence of a break-in, and no one had been caught on camera taking anything. But the fact that the door had been opened again, and the lock had been broken twice, made it clear that something wasn't right. They took a report and promised to look into it, but deep down, I knew it wasn't going to be easy to find whoever was behind this. The police never found anyone. Over the weeks that followed, the sensation of being watched lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there, waiting for the right moment to return. And I could never fully trust that my home was safe again. No matter how many locks I put on the door, or how many cameras I installed, the knowledge that someone had been inside, had been in my space, kept me up at night, wondering when they would come back. Story 30. I had agreed to house sit for my friend Emma while she went away for the weekend. It wasn't the first time I had looked after her place, and everything seemed normal. The house was quiet, just as I remembered it, cozy, with the familiar scent of lavender in the air and the soft hum of the refrigerator in the background. I had arrived in the early afternoon, and after settling in, I spent some time playing with her dog Max in the backyard before heading inside to prepare dinner. As evening rolled in, I decided to check on Max upstairs. He usually liked to nap in the guest bedroom, curled up on his bed by the window. I had been downstairs for a while, so I wasn't sure if he was still up there, or if he had wandered downstairs to join me. I walked up the stairs, the wooden floorboards creaking under my feet as I passed the old family photos on the wall. Everything felt peaceful, just like the last time I stayed here. When I reached the guest bedroom, I noticed that the door was shut. Strange, I thought. Usually, Max would push the door open when he wanted to come in or out. I grabbed the doorknob and turned it, but it wouldn't budge. At first, I thought it was just stuck, but after trying again and again, I realized it was locked from the inside. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should call Emma and ask if she had locked the door for some reason. But she had never mentioned it before, and I didn't want to bother her with something so trivial. I stood there for a few seconds, thinking about what to do. The idea of forcing the door open didn't sit well with me, but I was worried about Max. What if he was stuck in there or something had happened? I looked around and noticed a small key holder near the kitchen, where Emma kept spare keys. It was worth a shot. I quickly grabbed the key, returned to the guest room, and tried it in the lock. To my surprise, it turned easily. I slowly opened the door, half expecting to see Max lying in his usual spot. But when the door creaked open, the room was empty. There was no sign of the dog anywhere. I walked in, my heart pounding in my chest. The bed was perfectly made, the window slightly ajar to let in a cool breeze, but Max was nowhere to be found. I scanned the room, checking behind the furniture and under the bed, but there was no sign of him. Confusion began to settle in as I turned to leave, wondering where he could have gone. That's when I noticed something strange on the bed. At first, I thought it was just a piece of paper, but as I got closer, I saw that it was a note, folded neatly in the center of the bedspread. The handwriting was sharp and precise, written in black ink. My stomach dropped when I read the words, "You're not supposed to be here." A chill ran down my spine. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Why would someone leave a note like this in Emma's house? And where was Max? Was this some kind of prank? But the more I thought about it, the more it felt like something far more sinister was at play. I checked the rest of the room once again, opening the closet doors and searching the floorboards, but there was no sign of the dog. I slowly backed out of the room, locking the door behind me, my mind spinning with questions. Who would leave a note like that in a house where I was supposed to be looking after things? My first instinct was to call Emma, but then I hesitated. I didn't want to worry her over something that might be nothing, but the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I felt. I called her anyway, hoping she would have some kind of explanation. When she picked up, her voice sounded cheerful, completely unaware of anything unusual. I told her about the locked door and the note, trying to keep my voice calm, but I could hear the concern in my own tone. Emma laughed, telling me that she had never locked the door, and that she had no idea why there would be a note like that in the room. She reassured me that everything was fine and that I shouldn't worry. But her words didn't ease the knot in my stomach. After I hung up, I paced around the house, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest. I checked the doors and windows again, double-checking that everything was locked. Max still hadn't appeared, and the longer he stayed gone, the more worried I became. I decided to head back upstairs and take another look, convinced that I must have missed something the first time. Maybe Max had somehow slipped out of the room without me noticing, or maybe he was hiding somewhere in the house. I stood in the hallway, staring at the guest room door, the memory of the note still fresh in my mind. I took a deep breath and turned the doorknob again, this time more cautiously. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside, scanning the room once more. But everything was still the same, no sign of Max, no indication that anything was amiss. I looked down at the bed, and to my surprise, the note was gone. My heart skipped a beat. I searched the room again, but the note had completely vanished. Panic began to rise within me. How could a note just disappear? I turned to leave, and that's when I heard a soft scratching sound coming from the closet. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly approached the door, wondering if it was Max or if something else was inside. I opened the closet cautiously, and there, in the corner, was Max curled up and shivering, as though he had been there for hours. He looked up at me with wide, fearful eyes, and I could sense that something had terrified him. I quickly gathered him in my arms and left the room, locking the door behind me. As I sat downstairs, holding Max close, I tried to rationalize what had happened, but nothing made sense. The note, the locked door, the dog's strange behavior, it all felt wrong. I stayed at Emma's house for the rest of the night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to reveal itself.